Chapter 967. Chapter 967. Familiar. Miguel stared at these words for a very long time, his eyes eventually closing as he fell into a state of deep meditation. The 12-pointed star was the most important symbol of the Luxnix family. Despite the fact they called their lineage factor the snowy star owl, for some odd reason, within their ethereal glabellas, their light elemental embryos manifested exactly as a 12-pointed star would. Of course, this was a secret no one would know about unless a member of the Luxnix family went out of their way to speak of it. However, even aside from this alone, there were still their feather sword warriors who used the star as a symbol of their prestige. There was no doubting that the 12-pointed star was of immense importance to the Luxnix family and their strength. However, almost no one understood its significance and even less understood just what the origins of it was. Miguel, though, understood that everything originated with this tablet. If it didn't exist, maybe there would be no Luxnix family today. And now, after all these years, he had finally come to grasp a clue about just what all of this could mean. Despite the calm look on Miguel's face currently, he was doing his best to stop his seething blood. Since his youth, Miguel had always been extraordinarily talented. However, he was limited by two major factors. For a better user experience, the first was that he was born in a world capped at 6th-dimensional potential. Though planet Luxnix was at a peak amongst 6th-dimensional worlds, it was ultimately still that. Compared to 7th-dimensional worlds, it was still too lacking. And, compared to 7th-dimensional worlds nearing the 8th dimension like the Morales family world, it might as well have been an ant by the roadside. Regardless of his talent, this would always be a limiter. The second factor that would always limit him was his 6th-dimensional lineage factor. If he truly wanted to progress, there would come a time where his snowy star owl lineage factor became not only useless to him, but even a hindrance. Luckily, he was born with another talent that could mitigate this somewhat, but these would always be two anchors on his talent, anchors he could never get rid of, unless he could learn these words. Miguel wasn't a fool. Prophecies often had so many potential interpretations that taking anything at face value could end in his death. For all he knew, union meant Elsa devouring his blood whole like she had done during their battle. In such a case, this prophecy would have little to do with himself as he would be dead. With how fast he had seen Ana's progress to be, though he felt that she too would be limited by her birth and upbringing like he was, it wasn't impossible to see this as a probable conclusion. When things are framed in this manner, there were all sorts of things that these words could mean. The worst part was that even if Miguel placed these words in the most favorable light, he might still lose out. For a better user experience, for example, what if union referred to a child between himself and this mysterious woman? Though he wouldn't be opposed to it considering the small part of her beauty he had seen, how would the talent of a child help him? He wasn't an old man. He had yet to reach a point where the only way to progress would be passing on his lineage to another. He had no interest in having a child who could surpass him. What he wanted was power he could grasp on his own. After cycling through these thoughts, Miguel managed to calm himself. Now, the beating of his heart and the slow circulation of his blood matched the indifference on his face. With so many potential interpretations, Miguel decided on patience. He would observe the situation for a while longer. If it was a prophecy, then that meant it was destined to happen. By definition, he shouldn't have to do anything overt to cause it to happen. Of course, there was always the chance that this wasn't a prophecy and was rather a helpful clue. After all, if this tablet was what bestowed the 12-pointed star upon them, then it was more of a guider than a prophesier of the future, right? This was also a possibility that Miguel had thought of. But he still decided on patience. He would calmly observe things for now. If he was right, then things should organically fall into place. On the other hand, if it was a clue, he would act accordingly to the circumstances. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. For now, he only had one real goal, to ensure that Ana did not die. It was that simple. This was why he hadn't alerted his family elders about the appearance of Meal and gave no resistance. In addition to this, he chose not to tell anyone about his findings. If this was a prophecy, it was best that the maximum number of individuals acted as naturally as possible. Only if it turned out not to be one would he mobilize his family members should something beyond his control occur. After organizing his thoughts, Miguel sank into a true meditation, motes of light slowly accumulating around him. In the presence of this tablet, it felt like all bottlenecks would be loosened and the speed of his practice would accelerate many times over. Since he was already here, he might as well take advantage and also grasp the chance to replenish his stamina. Miguel could feel his lane toward the 6th dimension spreading open and wide. If he wanted to, he could step through it at any time, but for some reason he had always held back from doing so, continuously consolidating himself within the fifth. Maybe only a select few number of individuals would know exactly why. Miguel gazed longingly at the path ahead before suppressing it and focusing on rejuvenating himself. As his senses swept through his body, checking for any weaknesses and focusing on improving, he swept over a particular location above his right hip, flickering with the lights of a familiar innate node. Visit. For the best no_vel_it_G experience. Chapter 968. Chapter 968 Berserk God Lineage Factor. Beads of sweat fell down Meal's brow as he channeled the strength of the bronze tablet. His strength seeped outward, pouring into Aina's body and delicately erasing much of what was her. Yuri stood to the side, feeling very nervous. Before, she hadn't been aware of just how important this was for Aina, at least not until it was described for her by her adoptive father. The truth of the matter was that though the Brazinger family was quite disgusting in their toting of eugenics and the importance of bloodline purity, there was a method to their madness, keyword being madness. The Brazinger family's lineage factor was known as the Berserk God lineage factor. This was its true name. What had been displayed on Earth was nothing more than the tip of an iceberg that branch family members would be held to. However, just how berserk you were depended on the purity of your bloodline. For Aina, who was only half Brazinger on top of not receiving any of the family's special rituals or training, her lineage factor was far more berserk than it was God. This lineage factor was objectively powerful. In its purest form, it was a lineage factor that many would scratch and claw to have. Its abilities could be broken down into a few aspects. The first was overwhelming strength. Every single muscle fiber of a Brazinger family members was worth more than that of another individual, even most strength lineage factors. Its potential for explosion and power was simply beyond reason. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. The second aspect was battle sense. The instincts of a berserk god existed on a separate plane all to its own. Their ability to adapt and change their combat style to counter their enemies would make it feel as though they were all combat geniuses. What Lionel had to calculate they did on instinct and at a much faster speed on top of that depending on how pure their bloodlines were. The third aspect was rebirth. After experiencing terrible injury, a long-fought battle, or masochistic training, upon healing, a berserk god would have the strength of their bodies increase proportional to the weight of what they experienced. The fourth and final aspect was an affinity for all weapons. Whether it was a sword, a battle axe, a spear, even fists and kicks, a berserk god wasn't restricted to any weapon or martial art. They were geniuses of battle, existences created to wreak havoc on a battlefield. This was the true ability of the Brazinger family. The only person that Lionel had ever met who might have the true berserk god lineage factor was Simeon. However, he was always focused on his beast taming and genetic manipulation abilities, and Lionel had never seen him fight in hand-to-hand combat. Even now, it seemed that the Brazinger family and maybe even the other three families had hidden themselves very deeply. Knowing this, it was easy to see that what Aina experienced was an extremely perverted interpretation of the berserk god. She only received some of these abilities in part and without clear or purposeful direction to any of them. But this wasn't all her fault. How was it that despite being half Morales and only half Luxnix, Lionel received their lineage factors in full while Aina did not? The answer was simple: it was done on purpose. Visit. For the best no_vel_it_G experience, the curse Aina faced was just the tip of the iceberg and also acted as a cruel agitator on her mental state, warping her emotions and her reality. How could anyone be completely sane after experiencing years of torturous itching and peaks and valleys of horrid pain? It was all done on purpose to make Aina fall further and further into depravity. The fact she had even a semblance of humanity left in her was a testament to just how mentally strong she was to begin with. The Brazinger family lineage factor was altered so that when met with interference with other bloodlines, it would deviate from its predestined path. The result of this would be a deviation in the mind state that resulted in oversensitivity. In the beginning, this oversensitivity would only be minor. For example, it might be as benign as suddenly becoming greatly embarrassed when a boy you liked confessed to you, even to the point of running away with a blushing face despite the fact you were normally an assertive and confident woman. However, as time progressed, it would steamroll and increase to the point the smallest things became enormous and the tiniest insecurities became tall mountains. Eventually, just the most minor activation of their bloodline would result in this person going berserk, overdrafting their bodies, and ultimately dying. It could be said that if not for Aina's self-healing abilities, she would have long since fallen for the plot of this ancestor of the Brazinger family. It could even be said that due to meeting Lionel and allowing herself to fall for him, Aina had delayed the strongest onset of these side effects for as long as she could. However, this tablet provided a unique opportunity to reset the damage done and undo this second curse the Brazinger family had placed on Aina. Visit. For a better user experience, when the tablet erased a personality from a shadow, there was no living entity to cause the rebirth of that personality. However, Aina was different. She was a person with a propensity toward a certain disposition. As long as she was given time, she would become the very same Aina once again. This was why Emil had emphasized that Yuri should follow Aina around, but that she should also allow Aina to grow and make mistakes on her own. Only in this way would Aina grow to be her most authentic self. The story that wasn't told, though, was that it had taken Emil decades to accumulate the amount of energy he was currently giving to Aina now. As stoic as he was, as unemotional and silent as he was, as harsh as he was, the one thing that would always be true is that he loved his daughter. That said, there was one matter that would be grating to most people. Just who had power enough to alter the course of a lineage factor in this way? Who could place a curse that followed a bloodline like a reaper, gatekeeping it for generations to come? If Lionel had been there, especially as he watched the pieces of a force arc break and shatter, floating above Aina's head, his dreamscape would have sparked with several arcs of lightning. When his dreamscape settled down, he would suddenly think back to a man he had learned of in the Joan Zone. A man they called God. A man capable of copying the abilities of people into force arts. Aina's eyes suddenly shot open. The latest _IP_SODIES are on the website. Chapter 969. Chapter 969. Sensitive Earth was in a completely different state than the last time Lionel had been here. Where there had once been rubble and debris, there were nothing but large stretches of greenery and nature. Whatever wreckage the metamorphosis had left behind had long since been cleaned up, turning Earth from a concrete giant to a world that placed great emphasis on its natural beauty, something Earth, especially in comparison to other worlds, had a lot of. The Ascension Empire had taken advantage of the boon between the fourth and eventual fifth dimensions to cause this great change. In this span of time, Earth had experienced many force eruptions and natural phenomena of the like that greatly accelerated its growth. Thanks to this, with just a small bit of help from humans who moved all the useless metals and artificial bricks out of the way, Earth was able to flourish in the way it was always meant to. Like this, the only marks of old Earth and its technologies were the 9 major populous hubs of Earth, one to each of the 9 provinces. This included places like the Imperial Capital and the Royal Blue Fort. Outside of these cities and forts, there were only large expanses of greenery. There were trees that already rose up hundreds of meters into the air, there were precious herbs and grasses growing around every corner, and many beasts had been released from their experimental islands to populate and grow. Some of these beasts became food for humans, some became sparring partners, and others became a core part of maintaining the balance of Earth's ecosystem. Just from this alone, the talent of Earth and its world was on clear and full display. It looked as though these resources had been growing for thousands, even tens of thousands of years. But the truth was that these beautiful displays of nature had only been present for just a handful of years. Visit. For a better user experience still, these changes were absolutely nothing compared to Earth's 2 moons. The original still retained the name Moon while the second was dubbed Avalon by Emperor Fox. Lionel knew little of the Moon and its colonies, but they were every bit as part of Earth and had also faced terrains attack those years ago. Before, the Moon had to be terraformed to maintain a population. And even then this population was forced to stay within a climate-controlled dome. However, after the 4th dimension descended, things began to change, allowing for the dome to be done away with and for the Moon to begin to gain characteristics of a world all to its own. This was in thanks to Earth's fold of reality expanding and beginning to encompass larger and larger regions. Now, the Moon had unique herbs that even Earth itself couldn't grow. And though it didn't have large bodies of water or oceans, it had begun to have its own self-sustaining lakes in addition to its own true atmosphere. The people of the Moon also seemed to take a unique evolution path compared to the people of Earth. Though they still looked human, they tended to be taller, more fragile, and had stronger minds comparatively speaking. Likewise, Avalon also underwent great changes. The kingdom of Camelot was no more and was rather taken over by Secretary Marquis Pendragon. The latest _IP_SODIES are on the website. The more primitive side of Camelot had been washed away in favor of more modern comprehensions. In addition, the greatest benefit Camelot brought, its population, was spread out and divided amongst the 9 provinces of Earth. Ultimately, the people of Camelot weren't alien to the people of Earth and were easily accepted. After all, these were people created and based on themselves. How could they not assimilate well? It could be said that the only real growing pain were the somewhat outdated and backward ideas of the people of Camelot. They had yet to learn of the progressivism of modern times. But, ironically, it was the retreat of Earth from a technologically central ideal that helped this assimilation work all the more. In a lot of ways, the people of Earth felt like they were going backwards while the people of Camelot felt that they were being accelerated forward. This allowed the two groups to meet in the middle and reach a happy medium. It was amidst all these changes that Lionel returned to Earth. Hovering high above the sky, how could he not be shocked? He hadn't expected such large, sweeping changes. In fact, he partly believed that he would come back to find the same dilapidated buildings. At this moment he felt like he had grasped a difference between his grandfather and him. Lionel believed that he was quite forward-thinking and quick on his feet, even not hesitating to spend what an entire kingdom would in a year just for a single month of progress. However, it was clear that working harder didn't trump working smarter. Visit. For a better user experience in just a handful of years, not even quite year 3, Earth's entire face had changed. And Lionel was certain that his grandfather had planned it to be this way from the very beginning. There wasn't a single step that he had taken that was out of line of this goal. Now, despite being a fledgling world, Earth was already in the 5th dimension, had no human invalids to worry about, and had conquered all of their land without trouble. Lionel had naively thought that while his grandfather was struggling with getting Earth back on track that he'd be able to make some headway toward catching up, but he felt more wrong than he ever had before. Now that he was more sensitive to certain things, upon stepping onto his grandfather's territory, he felt a suffocating aura from all sides. He had to try twice as hard just to take in half the oxygen he normally would. He didn't need to look around to understand that his grandfather already knew that he was here and that he was back. No, it could be said that nothing that happened within Earth's territory or fold of reality would escape his notice. His eyes were everywhere. Lionel's lips suddenly curled beside himself, his gaze turning toward the imperial capital before he shot in that direction. The latest _sodies are on _the website. Chapter 970. Chapter 970, El Hope, Halt. Each one of the auras were blazing, several guards sent piercing gazes toward the air. Though they too wore golden armor, it was nothing like the superfluous garbage the guard of the Force Crafting Guild wore. Each one had an undeniable momentum that almost threatened to peel Lionel's skin back. However, as though he hadn't heard a single word, Lionel descended from the skies, landing at the very top of the ancient tree structure that was the imperial capital. Lionel strode forward, his pale violet hair fluttering and his hands in his pockets. A light smile hung from his face. "You're not going to attack me, are you? Prince Lionel. Flying in the imperial capital is an offense even for you." A hard-nosed man stood forward, his demeanor unchanged in the face of Lionel's smile. "And why is that?" Lionel's steps paused. Visit. For the best no_vil_ed_sng experience at the moment, he stood at the base of the imperial palace. A large staircase of white marble and gold lay in his wake. Lining these stairs, warriors that even gave Lionel pressure stood. Despite being in the 4th dimension, Lionel felt that their combat experience was far beyond him. In addition, he could tell that as Earth continued to evolve, so too did their abilities. It likely wouldn't be long before the base strength of everyone on Earth was of the 5th dimension. This was the true fearsome ability of a world with so much talent. Lionel hadn't experienced it before since he was away from Earth, but after returning he felt that his ability was being nurtured as well. As Earth's fold of reality grew, there would eventually come a point where Lionel wouldn't have to return in order to take part in these benefits. He felt quite refreshed at this moment, completely unlike his demeanor the last time he had come here. "You will be seen as a threat to be immediately taken down. Since you have broken the rules, we will have to detain you." "Ah, and that's the case even if I'm not a real threat." "Yes." The man answered seriously, not wavering in the slightest. He seemed unmoved by Lionel's status, his smile, his charisma and even Lionel's strength. None of it mattered. "I see. Emperor Fox is very good at raising loyal warriors. I'm impressed. I would try to poach you, but I have a feeling that I would fail." The man's gaze narrowed. "Poach him? What did that mean? Was this prince trying to rebel?" The latest _sodies are on _the website. The grip he had on his halberd multiplied in strength, his aura blazing. All of the guards reacted in unison, each of their halberds also raising. Even without them completing their actions, Lionel could feel a unique force art of sorts resonating between them. Interesting, so force arts can be used like this as well, How fascinating. Emperor Fox seems to know quite a lot for a man who should have been born on a mortal world. There was a lot about his grandfather that Lionel didn't quite understand. For example, for Lionel to have the Luxnix family lineage factor, his grandfather would have had to have somehow taken a woman of that family as a wife. But how had he, the emperor of a third-dimensional world, taken the woman of a sixth-dimensional one as an empress? It was all quite curious. At that moment, the enormous doors of the imperial palace opened, separating out the snaking golden dragons delicately carved onto its surface, and even more importantly, the immortal tree that it wrapped around. Soon, a spectacled man appeared that Lionel immediately recognized as his uncle. "You returned," he said plainly. "I have. For what purpose?" "To shamelessly steal resources and to issue a challenge," Lionel replied without blinking. The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. The former makes sense. As for the latter, you aren't worthy of doing such a thing yet. Lionel's smile brightened. My grandfather owes me almost 22 years' worth of birthday presents. I have to seek my reimbursement somehow. And as to whether I'm worthy or not, that doesn't matter much to me either. I will issue it either way. One day Earth will be mine. Though Lionel said things like this, there was a hint of coldness in his eyes that made his uncle's gaze narrow. If there was anything Lionel didn't like, it was not being respected. His arrogance had been buried deep within his bones for a very long time because there was nowhere for it to flourish on Earth. There was nothing worth him rising to the occasion of. But now things were different. He not only had a goal, there was actually someone who deemed to believe that he wouldn't accomplish it. Though that wasn't enough to tear into his reverse scale, it was definitely enough to leave an itch on it. The moment Lionel said these words, the halberds of the Imperial Guards all rose in unison, their blades carving out a sharp path toward Lionel. Yet even as he faced a torrential rain of force that could obliterate a city with just its momentum alone, Lionel remained unmoved. At that moment, a roar that seemed to originate from the very depths of his heart manifested. Lionel didn't even open his mouth, and yet it swallowed the momentum of the Imperial Guards and the Imperial Palace whole, making the white gold hair of his uncle whip backward as though hit with a wall of wind. It felt like Lionel had suddenly become 10 times his original size, his body looming over the capital and his momentum causing the earth to quake. Mists of violet fog rose around his body, a sight alone that made his uncle's pupils constrict into pinholes. The roar drowned all things out, even their thoughts. It wouldn't be until a long while later that they came to understand that it wasn't a roar they had heard, but rather the will of Lionel's heart. The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. Without another word, he turned and began to walk away before coming to a sudden pause. "All right. I used my imperial pendant on claiming White City if I recall correctly. I hope no one has stretched their hands toward my things." With that, Lionel flickered and vanished. Chapter 971. Chapter 971. Head-butting Emperor Fox laughter rang through the spring gardens. He laughed so hard that the birds dispersed and the force around him seemed to warp. If it wasn't for certain protections placed around the palace, maybe the whole of Earth would have heard his laughter. Lionel's uncle soon made his way to find his father in this state. Quite frankly, he was speechless. Maybe if Earth was still a third-dimensional world, Lionel's rebellion would be quite meaningless. There were simply 1,000,001 ways to stamp out whatever hope he had toward fulfilling his goals. There was a limit to what mere mortals could do in that aspect, especially when the Empire had already unified the whole of Earth. Now that Earth once again had enemies to face toward the outside, the Slayer Legion had returned to their rightful place as the protectors of the Emperor, so there wasn't even this foundation for Lionel to use either. It could be said that if Earth was in the third dimension, they would have the luxury of laughing and watching Lionel's ambitions fizzle out. After all, he was their own flesh and blood. Sometimes there was no need to be so harsh with family. But in this sort of situation it was much different. Not only had Earth entered the fifth dimension, Lionel clearly had methods of freely traveling between worlds. On top of that, they were well aware that he had a father who was quite unfathomable. And Lionel's uncle knew well just how much Lionel's mother loved and what kind of temper she had for certain people. This was all to say that if Lionel's mother learned of Lionel's ambitions, she would probably directly pass on her position as crown princess to him. And even if Emperor Fox voided it, he would end up having to fight both his grandson and his daughter. If things continued like this, especially since Lionel was a brat who might not be able to see the bigger picture, Earth might suddenly be shaken with internal conflict when their blades should have been pointed toward the outside. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Knowing all of this, despite the fact Galeran had very rarely questioned his grandfather in his life, he still couldn't help but speak. Imperial Father, is this really a laughing matter? Emperor Fox sputtered with laughter, his white gold hair shimmering as his emerald irises twinkled. Look at that, Galeran. He's even rubbing off on you. You actually question me for once. Galeran frowned slightly before his expression became somewhat bitter. Maybe only his father could make his expression warp like this. You should learn from that brat a little bit more. You need to be more rebellious. Don't you find it sad that I gave the position of crown heir to your little sister and not you? You would think that would have bred at least a little resentment in you. I expected to find some undercurrents brewing, maybe some schemes as you pulled the court to your side. How is it that your sister has been gone for decades and yet you've done nothing? I'm quite disappointed. Galeran was speechless. His father was lamenting. I'm not trying to start a rebellion? But this could. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. The prince truly had no idea how he should approach this. Lionel's words couldn't have been clearer. Yes. That brat finally grew some balls. It's about time. Galeran almost choked on air. This was the most vulgar thing he had ever heard his father say. What the hell was going on today? Last time he came here he was far too much of a pansy. He hated me but he hardly even showed it, letting his purpose become warped beneath the ideologies of another. A fox man should think for himself. But Imperial Father, he's? Galeran shook his head. He's being quite shameless. This was the best argument Galeran could think of. It was clear he had been rendered completely speechless by his father. Shameless? I think it's the opposite. If he had wanted to, he could slink around in the shadows, never letting anyone know his purpose before he suddenly struck at a critical time. But he actually came here to issue a direct challenge. What's so shameless about that? That's not what I mean. You mean resources? Well, the brat is right. I do owe him many birthday presents. Visit. For a better user experience after hearing this, Galeran really didn't know what to say anymore. He and his own son were like two sane people in a family filled with maniacs. Whether it was his brother-in-law, his nephew, his own little sister, his mother, even, they were all insane. Sometimes he wondered if he had been swapped with another child at some point. He didn't know why he was so surprised. This was the same father of his who laughed up a lung after he learned that Lionel almost destroyed the Royal Blue Fort. To put that matter into real perspective, their Ascension Empire had known of the threat of the ocean for a very long time. Royal Blue Fort was one of their most powerful chess pieces toward countering this invasion of sorts. Yet, his father had laughed about it like it was nothing. Emperor Fox finally stopped laughing and shook his head. Your vision is still too narrow, Galeran. The reason he can do this is because he knows his worth. There are still some things that are inconvenient for me to do personally while he's well aware that he's maybe the strongest warrior on Earth right now. The oceanic beasts are just the beginning, another war is coming. As long as he's working, who cares if he takes some advantages? That said, he'll still have to pay a price for leaving us behind to go and chase skirts. Galeran's expression twitched, suddenly remembering that Lionel had mentioned White City before he left. Emperor Fox burst into another fit of laughter, this one even more uproarious than the last. He likes his moral high ground so much, right? I'd like to see what he does when that moral high ground is exactly what's holding him back from taking what he wants. Visit. For the best no_vel_NG experience, Galeran felt a headache coming on. He really wasn't ready to deal with the logistics of head-butting between a prince and the Dove Grand Prime Minister family. Just one more chapter coming later today, DKM. Chapter 972. Chapter 972. Then. White City was the very same city Lionel had dropped from the sky to crush Anared and the Variant Invalid. Truth be told, he had only just remembered that he had traded the ruby imperial pendant he had earned for it. He thought it might be a convenient way to get things started. After all, he didn't have the patience to build a new city even though he was uniquely suited to doing such a thing. As for what Lionel wanted the city for, it would be a convenient fort. Plus, he still had the enormous spatial force art he could repair and use again. Before he could only use it once before it got too damaged. But he was more than confident in making it even sturdier now. Though, it would take an even more powerful formation to move about in a fifth-dimensional world. Lionel wasn't really sure what happened to White City though. He had dropped it right in front of the imperial capital. And, now that he thought about it, there should have been a second city in the surroundings, not to mention the third city, which was the one he crashed. The state of White City should be pretty terrible if it wasn't touched. After all, it wouldn't come out unscathed from such a thing. And there was also no telling if it was still around the capital or if it had been moved elsewhere. Truth be told, Lionel hadn't been paying much attention when he was on his way here. He had been moving too fast and was entirely focused on crashing the capital to cause a commotion. Well, he had managed to do that, so now he was content with settling down and making some money. However, when Lionel laid eyes on White City, his brow twitched. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. If it wasn't for the fact he could still sense the lingering remnants of his large-scale spatial array, he wouldn't have even connected the two cities into one at all. The White City he had once known was nowhere to be seen. The city was about the same size as it had always been. Since terrain had never quite fully conquered its own world, its cities were purposely built large so that it could accommodate large numbers of people and enormous sums of resources. This was to say that it was massive, about double the size of a normal large city. However, what was shocking were the number of people and the hustle and bustle. The economy was booming to a mind-numbing degree. Lionel could almost smell the money in the air. But what was maybe most shocking was that maybe only half the number of people here were actually from Earth. As for the other half, they had clear energy signatures that marked them as alien to this world. What Lionel didn't know was that White City and the other Skyfall cities, as they were now known as by the people of Earth, had become hubs for trade and diplomacy. The other Skyfall cities had been razed to the ground. But these two, White City and Black City, the latter of which had once pincered the imperial capital with Kiefer City, were the two that remained and had become great tourist spots. Emperor Fox didn't allow people to freely travel throughout Earth, but this made perfect sense. The resources Earth had as a talented Earth was far beyond what even many disaster worlds could hope to have. In order to hunt on Earth, one needed to pay an exorbitant price, usually worth more than even the resources one would manage to gather. However, many still bit the bullet and paid this price because the talent of beasts here was far beyond what they could find elsewhere. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the beast crystals of Earth provided a unique opportunity to increase the strength of their abilities. Anyone who had any sort of money at all would definitely send their children here. The result was Earth swimming in more money than it even knew what to do with. Let alone robbing a force crafting guild, Lionel should be thinking about robbing his grandfather's coffers. This was all to say that the city Lionel stood above on his black surfboard treasure, having long since been upgraded by him to the point it could stand hundreds of meters in the air even in a fifth-dimensional world, was an enormous well of resources. And yet, Lionel knew he couldn't casually touch it. Lionel's expression turned cold. There was no way this city was functioning on its own, it was definitely being controlled by someone. Though Lionel hadn't heard his grandfather laughing, he could very well imagine that old man's brilliant grin. It was almost more annoying that that old man was more handsome than he should be at his age. Lionel almost wanted to tell him that his time was up and to give it up, but he knew that would just make him look even more bitter than he already was. What was he supposed to do? He couldn't just kick these people out. Even though half of them weren't from Earth, the other half relied on this place for a livelihood. They had already built their lives and families here over the course of the last 3 years. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, he couldn't use force either. How would they react to someone who just tyrannically took over their home after they had been living in peace for so long? And he most definitely couldn't just kill them all. Just from a glance, Lionel could tell that there was practically no one in poverty in this place. Though his grandfather's genocide was something Lionel could never accept, what he did have to accept was just how good of a position it had put Earth in. They were in a place where every Earthener could prosper and benefit without needing for anything. Lionel stood a distance from the city, hovering in the air with his surfboard. After a moment, his lip curled. With a wave of his arm, he sent out several messages. It was about time he began. "The family, is it? Let's play then. Visit. For a better _user experience." Chapter 973. Chapter 973 Governance. Lionel slipped through the city gates completely invisible to the eyes of the guards. He didn't feel like going through an inspection process, nor did he have anything proving his status as a prince outside of his face, so he felt that it wasn't worth it. After he was a distance away, he found a location to reappear and blended into the crowd. With just a few minutes of observation, though, Lionel realized that things weren't so simple. Whether it was the residents of Earth that lived here or the tourists from other worlds, each had their own identification cards. It only took Lionel a moment to realize that Earth had replaced its original monitoring system with another one. What was surprising though was that this monitoring system was both less intrusive, and most surprisingly, it revolved around the very same wristwatch the people of Earth had always had. Of course, outsiders weren't given their own wristwatches. Instead they were given badges they had to use to verify their purchases. Essentially, without either a wristwatch or a tourist badge, one could only walk around the city aimlessly without benefiting from anything. As Lionel continued to walk around, he picked up on more details. For example, outsiders had a higher sales tax to pay, they were restricted from certain regions, and they were only allowed to rent property but couldn't own anything. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Everything from top to bottom was meticulously organized, and despite searching for it, Lionel couldn't find signs of corruption and, more shockingly, poverty. It was as though the people of Earth had all simultaneously been risen in status. But Lionel knew that this was far from the case. The cruel underbelly of this was that the poor had already been killed by his grandfather. All that were left were individuals with great connections, wealth and political affiliations. Of course, no country or world could possibly function without labor workers or those that did less than lucrative jobs, and yet it seemed that this had been handled as well. It seemed that Earth had either begun training force crafters of their own or had invited over crafters to automate much of the labor process. And where it was impossible to do this, there were the people of terrain. Lionel had already noted that there was no poverty, and this was true. But this was only in the in-your-face, dirty slums and grimy streets sort of ways. The true underpinning of what allowed the people of Earth to continue living their lush lifestyles while everything in the city seemed to work on its own were the inconspicuous workers wearing gray tunics and pants, gliding through the city silently with their heads lowered and their gazes glued to the ground. The invasion of terrain didn't just end with the war. After all, the cities themselves resulted in an influx of tens of millions of people who had been essentially uprooted from their homes by their city lords. After their city lords died, they were left behind with nothing and no way to get back home, leaving them stranded on Earth without recourse or power to do anything. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. In truth, Lionel had at some point assumed that his grandfather would have them all massacred. The image he had of his grandfather was that he was a cruel man willing to do anything to hold on to his power and take a step ahead. Ultimately, tens of millions of terrain citizens, albeit far less talented than the people of Earth, were a threat to their forward progress. And yet, they had been seamlessly integrated to the point where even Lionel had almost not noticed them at all. With some more observation, Lionel came to understand this as well. I see. So he created a hierarchy system with the promise that those born 5 generations from now would become true citizens of Earth. With this promise in place, the current people of terrain are living silent and peaceful lives and are even helping Earth to fix its clear population problem. As long as they don't cause trouble, for generations from now they'll be able to say that they birthed children who were true people of Earth. Just from an hour of walking around the city, Lionel had seen several of what he would classify as sensual shops. Whether it was a small boutique that sold women's lingerie or even something more in your face like outright sex toy shops, they were here in quite large number. On top of that, Lionel had seen many parents walking about with toddlers and newborns. Such a thing would have been impossible to see right after the metamorphosis, and most children did not survive the calamity for obvious reasons. Lionel could feel a clear push for the people of Earth to have children. Visit. For a better user experience. Despite there being so many sensual shops, there wasn't a single brothel in sight. In addition, despite the fact a woman of terrain could have a 5th-generational baby so long as she slept with a man of Earth, there seemed to be an invisible barrier between the two groups. Picking up on all of these subtleties, Lionel was astonished. This level of governance was far beyond his capabilities. He couldn't help but feel a small bit of respect for his grandfather. Lionel's emotional intelligence worked best on a micro scale. Of course, he could impact things at a macro level too, with how he almost destroyed the foundation of Valiant Heart Mountain with just a few actions, but he still felt like he lacked the nuance and grace his grandfather had. However, with every step through the city Lionel took, he seemed to soak in something different, shifting his ideals and rebuilding them with new thoughts. To those who walked by him, it would almost seem like he was in a trance-like state of enlightenment. Before Lionel realized it, he had reached the end of his journey and found himself at what must have once been the city lord's mansion, though now, the flag of the Dove family flew high and proud. Halt. The Grand Prime Minister's estate is closed off to outsiders. Lionel kept walking forward as though he hadn't heard anything. Just when the guards wanted to take action, they found their legs rooted to the ground. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscore experience. Chapter 974. Chapter 974 Corner Office. The Dove family guards looked down in shock, only to find that their legs had suddenly been encased in stone. In that moment, it wasn't just the Dove family guards that were shocked, but the tourists in the area who treated the estate like a landmark to visit were stunned silent as well. In all their time here, no one had dared to stir up trouble. This was the first time they were seeing such a thing. Of course, what the crowd didn't know was that this wasn't true at all. How could there possibly not be any bad apples? It was just that these individuals had been dealt with swiftly and with the utmost secrecy. Hardly anyone was even aware that such events had occurred. But Lionel was the prince of the empire. He couldn't exactly be stopped ahead of time, right? A blinding pair of white gold wings appeared to Lionel's back in a flash. In one moment he was on the opposite side of the gate. In the next, he had leapt over, landing softly on the other side as a small gust of wind followed his movements. Lionel strolled forward with his hands in his pockets. Every guard that rushed forward found themselves cemented into the ground, not harmed but completely unable to move. The difference was so striking that it shook the observers to their core. They had no way of knowing just who this young man was. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_ng experience, Lionel swept a gaze forward. The Dove estate was Victorian in its construction. It had a somewhat castle-like, somewhat modern feel to it. It had great archways for each of its windows that melded seamlessly into the design. In addition to this, there were a few towers built right into it with a structure that finished the painting of a beautiful picture. The fences and gates that surrounded the property didn't obstruct the view at all. Lionel's actions were clear for all to see, from his gliding over the perfectly trimmed grass up to the point he began to walk up the stairs to the wide doors. To the surprise of the people watching, rather than alarms beginning to blare, the doors opened, revealing a man dressed in an archetypal butler uniform. Everything from his pristine white gloves, to his golden pocket watch and the tails of his suit were perfect. Welcome, Prince Lionel. The Dove family feels humbled by your visit. It was right then that the guards suddenly came to understand that they had been trying to stop the prince of an empire. Not only that, but a surge took hold of the crowd. Many of them were the people of Earth. The instant they heard Lionel's name, things clicked and a look of reverence flooded their expressions. Visit. For a better user experience to the people outside of Earth, Lionel was a wanted criminal. To the people of Earth, Lionel was the man who dropped a city that ended a war. What was important for an imperial family? It was making sure they held on to the love and adoration of the people. The more they were revered, the more godlike they seemed, the more power they would manage to consolidate. Quite frankly, Lionel hadn't expected such a reaction to his name. After all, the people of Earth should know that he was a criminal as well. However, it seemed that his grandfather had grasped an opportunity. Lionel couldn't help but be astonished by his grandfather's audacity. He knew that Lionel stood opposed to him, but he actually still took action to raise Lionel's legend. What would he do if the people revered him as a prince more than they revered him as an emperor? Lionel let out a sort of speechless laugh. His grandfather. He was the most arrogant bastard Lionel had ever met. Lionel gave the butler a gentle smile. Sorry about all this, I just came back and I don't have the credentials, so I could only choose this sort of crude method. Speaking of which, I have to thank the Dove family for taking care of my city so well. This is far beyond what I imagined I would come back to. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_ng experience, the butler was taken off guard by Lionel's smile. It was an obvious sign of disrespect that a mere butler would come to greet a prince, so why was he smiling? But the main issue was that the butler suddenly found it difficult to continue with a hard-nosed approach. That said, his lip twitched fiercely when he heard the second half of Lionel's spiel. This prince. The butler snapped out of his shock when he suddenly felt Lionel pat his shoulder. Before he could react, Lionel had invited himself in, stepping by him and into the residence. Without even needing the butler to guide him, Lionel cut through the home as though he lived here. The butler reached out to try and stop Lionel, but despite the fact Lionel seemed to be walking slowly, he was already 20 meters ahead of him by the time the butler reacted. The worst part was that the direction Lionel was headed in wasn't where the butler originally wanted to lead him. According to his orders, he was meant to bring Lionel to the young Mississippi. But Lionel was actually going to exactly the place the young master and Grand Prime Minister Dove were. A cold sweat covered the back of the butler. This prince really didn't know how to follow the rules of etiquette. But why was it so hard to get mad at him? Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_ng experience, Lionel went through 3 floors and 5 hallways, finding his way to a corner office that overlooked the city. With just a small knock, he entered, a gentle smile on his face. At the moment Lionel entered, he found what he almost felt were a pair of twins looking back at him. Both Tyrion and his father seemed to be cut from the same cloth. Despite being surprised by Lionel's appearance, they didn't seem to react much initially. It wasn't until Lionel took a seat next to Tyrion and facing Grand Prime Minister Dove that the two of them finally smiled lightly. Like this, 3 fake smiles met one another in a single corner office. Chapter 975. Chapter 975 Everything, right? It was only after sitting down with the father and son that Lionel finally began to pick out some differences between them. They both had on glasses, both were dressed prim and proper, both had measured and controlled attitudes. It could be said that the only difference between them was that Tyrion's father had a slight graying in his hair, but it was clear that even this was vanishing as he absorbed force day by day, just like how Lionel's grandfather was also continuously getting younger. I will be honest, I do not blame the two of you. The father-son pair were caught off guard. Usually, this would devolve into a game of pressure to see who it was would crack and be forced to speak first. In most cases, whoever spoke first would be seen as the more nervous of the two and thus be on the losing side of the discussion from then on. But not only did Lionel not wait, he began to speak almost immediately. It was hard to tell if he was simply not used to such royal etiquette, or if this was a tactic to throw them off. At the same time, I also don't have the patience to play these games. I'm on a little bit of a time crunch. I won't be young forever, you know. So, how about I lay things out how I see them? Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel sat comfortably in his seat and continued to smile. You two are not my enemies. We just happen to see things differently. To you this is necessary. While you might be a Grand Prime Minister family now, as Earth expands and its territory grows, it's impossible to say that your hold on power will remain the same. The best case is that it dilutes, the worst case is that you're forgotten to the annals of history and washed away along with the other noble families that failed to continue to meet high standards. This, however, is also an opportunity for you. You now suddenly have ample room to grow, whereas in the past you had already met a ceiling you couldn't break past. So, if a brat like me claims a city with a small bit of merit and then suddenly disappears for 3 years, it wouldn't be surprising that you would choose to swoop in. After all, there are many things you could say. For instance, you could claim that this isn't the White City I claimed. There are practically no parts of the city I once claimed remaining, and even a rational person might conclude that this was no longer my city to begin with. Tyrion's eyes narrowed, but he quickly recovered, continuing to listen to Lionel's words without saying anything himself. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Of course, none of those petty tricks really matter. Ultimately, I am a prince and this city was claimed for me by virtue of an imperial pendant. If you look at things this way, in terms of places on Earth that represent the imperial family's prestige, the imperial capital is number 1, and this city may very well be number 2. However, I'm sure you father and son pair are smart enough to understand this as well, which means you have several other tricks up your sleeve. If I were in your shoes, I just might send my butler to receive myself and announce my name and title to those present. Maybe very quickly the reverence the people held for me would take hold and I would walk around the city, suddenly finding that I couldn't take a step without someone looking toward me with a worshipful gaze. If that were to happen, I just might get full of myself and believe that I was untouchable. Once I began to believe that, I just might also think that snatching White City away by force was something that the citizens of this city wouldn't fight against and even something they might accept with open arms. But if I did that, I would be walking into a trap now, wouldn't I? This time even Grand Prime Minister Dove couldn't help but narrow his gaze, staring toward Lionel intently. Unlike his son though, he made no attempt to hide these changes. Visit. For the best experience, because if I were you after I did something so foolish, I would leave silently while allowing the underpinnings of the city I painstakingly built to crumble one by one. For example, I might use the contracts I've signed with merchants to manipulate the economy of the city. After all, those contracts were signed with White City, not the imperial capital or the Ascension Empire. These merchants might start withdrawing, decreasing the quality of life in this city and shifting it toward Black City instead. Once I was finished doing that, those merchants might start demanding lower tax rates as they would have less customers to sell to. How would they be able to protect their profit margins without some help from me? When I thought that problem was finished, I would suddenly realize that the hunters who came to White City to gain certificates to hunt beasts in the surroundings would suddenly plummet. And why wouldn't they? The merchants would have been forced to lower prices on them and haggle for their goods. At the same time, I would probably have been forced to raise the price of certification just to keep the city afloat. Why would they continue to come here when they could go to Black City instead? Then, just when everything seemed as though it was coming crashing down, the nobles you have in your pockets would finally begin to complain. If I lost my temper and used force to suppress them when they had legitimate matters to complain about, I would look like a tyrant, wouldn't I? By this point, I would barely be able to sustain the upkeep of the city, and the final nail in the coffin would become the people of Terrain. How would I be able to feed and clothe them without money? Without proper care, their residences would deteriorate, resulting in a true slums forming in the city and ultimately causing many to want to move away. Visit. For the best no_vil_undersg experience, just like that, White City would collapse under my rule and give or take 6 months to a year. That's everything, right? Lionel continued to smile lightly, observing the father-son pair. Chapter 976. Chapter 976. A smile. Lionel's smile didn't fade amidst the silence of the father-son pair. In fact, it only grew. It was clear that this silence meant something far different than it would have at the start of all of this. I see. Grand Prime Minister Dove suddenly spoke. His voice was deep and rumbling, a marked difference from his son's more light tone. It seemed that Lionel had finally found a second difference between them. Then what exactly do you propose, Your Highness? Lionel waved his hand. You don't need to call me that, just call me Lionel. Not like it matters much anyway, not like you two went out of your way to kneel when I entered. Tyrion's lip twitched. Members of the Grand Prime Minister family didn't have to kneel to princes. This was something that Lionel would have known had he not been raised outside the imperial family. But it didn't seem appropriate to correct him on this now since he had already waved it away so casually. As for what I propose, it is quite simple. For the next year, all profit White City makes will go to me. Beyond this, all shops that I come to own will be tax-free and work without restrictions. While I am away, this city will continue to be yours. Quite frankly, I plan to take White City and move it to the coast, but it is clear that this is impossible. So, instead, I'll be building a city myself. Grand Prime Minister Dove's gaze flashed, but he remained silent as he continued to listen. Visit. For a better user experience, in exchange for this, any force crafters you are nurturing can come under my wing for the time being if you aren't afraid of me poaching them away. In addition, any boom in White City's economy that are as a result of my actions can continue to be yours once I've gone and the year period I've marked out has passed. As for when I am in the city, I will take 30% of the revenue following this year period. Hearing Lionel conclude so simple, Grand Prime Minister Dove was quite shocked. He had expected to be completely fleeced by this prince, but Lionel had actually gone so easy on them? Though losing a year of revenue was a difficult pill to swallow, a year was ultimately just that. Before the metamorphosis, the human lifetime had more than doubled already, making a year worth far less than it had been in the past. Now, with the help of the metamorphosis force and the various rare force herbs Earth was continuously producing, they could live for even longer than that. In addition to this, Lionel said that after this year, he would only take 30% of the revenue for when he was actively in White City. He had already left for 3 years prior to today without a word, and though the Grand Prime Minister couldn't guarantee that Lionel wouldn't do this again, the fact that he wanted to build his own city was evidence enough. Without much thought, Grand Prime Minister Dove nodded. I find this deal to be agreeable. From this date until this time next year, all the revenue of the city will be yours. If you need crafter to help in your building a city, I will also provide them. If they are to your lacking, there is no problem with Prince poaching a few. As for your shops being tax-free, this is of course not a problem as well. I'm sure that the added business your endeavors will bring will leave us at a net positive regardless. There are easily half a dozen prime storefronts Prince can choose from. If you would like, you can have them all. Lionel smiled. It seemed that this Grand Prime Minister was quite the smart man. Oh right, just one more thing, Lionel said. When I say revenue, I mean all of it. Don't bother sending taxes to that old man for this year either. Grand Prime Minister Dove was rendered speechless. Firstly, Lionel was calling Emperor Fox old man. And, secondly, evading imperial taxes was not just a small crime. Even shaving a bit off the top was impossible, but not doing so for a whole year was a completely different level of face slapping. The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. Don't worry about it, I've already spoken to him about it. Really? Grand Prime Minister Dove looked toward Lionel skeptically. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that White City represented at least 20% of Earth's current wealth. Losing it for a year was not a small ask at all. The only reason Grand Prime Minister Dove wasn't bleeding was because most of that money went to the imperial family anyway, so what he was left with wasn't something he was unwilling to part with. The only thing he really needed to worry about was making sure all the guards and especially the terrain servants were properly taken care of and paid. But he was still willing to pay out of pocket to cover this for a year. Lionel, however, was clearly a maniac. Grand Prime Minister Dove couldn't even fathom what Lionel would do with this money. Just to put things into perspective, the eye-popping number of herb ores Lionel had given to Elther was something White City would make within 3 days. As exaggerated as that might sound, this was the true value of a world like Earth. The Ascension Empire was raking in funds hand over fist. Without more explanation, Lionel smiled and stood. By the way, Tyrion, I wanted to apologize. Tyrion, who had still been trying to wrap his mind around all this, suddenly started. He was surprised to the point of being speechless. When we first met I was a bit overly sensitive and ended up shattering your glasses. It was rash of me and something I shouldn't have done. I hope we can move past it. In exchange, how about I craft you a bronze treasure to your specifications? Visit. For a better user experience, Tyrion, who was almost always composed, didn't know what to do. He had never expected an apology for that and he had most definitely never expected Lionel to be so nice to him. But most shockingly of all, Lionel was a bronze crafter? Tyrion, quickly thank His Highness. Ah yes, right. Tyrion shot up from his seat and accepted Lionel's handshake. He looked deeply into Lionel's eyes, trying to find some sort of contempt or sneer, but all he saw was warmth that made him feel almost too comfortable. The grievances he had held toward Lionel suddenly vanished into the wind and he blushed beside himself. Lionel left the corner office with a smile on his face. He realized just how correct Anya had been. If he had had a warmer relationship with Tyrion from the very beginning, instead of lashing out at him for just looking at Aina back then, maybe this matter would have gone even smoother. If he wanted to succeed, he had to lead with a smile. There would always be time for him to use his fists later if the situation suited it. Young miss, please don't. As Lionel was about to leave the estate, he suddenly heard a familiar voice. When he looked back, he saw the butler chasing after a young lady that seemed to be in her very late teens, likely 18 or 19 years old. Despite her age, Lionel's first impression of her was that she was quite cute, in a cuddly sort of way. However, that fiery look in her eye as she stamped toward him was definitely anything but cuddly. Visit. For the best no_vel_it_G experience. Chapter 977. Chapter 977 Coasts. Lionel smiled lightly. He had been monitoring the butler with his internal sight ever since he entered the estate. Initially he had been rushing after Lionel, but after he realized he couldn't catch up, he had changed directions and shot off toward where this girl had been lying in wait. If Lionel had to make a guess at what happened, he had probably entered a wing of the estate that the butler didn't dare to enter. As such, the butler had no choice but to change tactics and go and seek help from this cute girl. It was very likely that this was the young woman the Dove family had prepared to field Lionel. And clearly she wasn't very happy that Lionel had ignored her while going straight off to her brother and father instead. It was rare that the young miss got a chance to do something important, so it felt like Lionel had snatched away her chance. The result was the poor butler chasing around someone he couldn't catch up to for the second time that day. You are Prince Lionel? Though it was a question, it almost came out like a demand. You could say so. Lionel chuckled. And you are. Visit. For a better user experience, I am Avery Dove, the young miss of the Dove family. We were meant to have a meeting today, but why is it that you seem to be leaving already? Lionel looked this girl up and down, suddenly realizing something. He had mostly met all of the noble young men and women during the war with Terrain. But back then, Avery was just 14 or 15 years old, far too young to participate. It was no wonder this was the first time Lionel was meeting her. I see, so it's young Miss Dove. It's a pleasure to meet you. I wasn't aware that you were waiting for me. My apologies. How about this? Your father said that there are 6 prime storefronts for me to choose from. Would you mind being my guide? Avery, who was fully prepared to be a young lioness, was caught off guard by Lionel's suggestion. She had felt that she would need to be more hard-nosed because she was a young woman, but especially so because she had this face of hers to overcome. Yes, I can. Avery didn't know the details, but she knew everything about White City. The moment Lionel mentioned those storefronts, she already knew exactly which ones he was referring to and even exactly how to get there from the estate. It could be said that she was well prepared. Though she hadn't spoken to her father or brother about this matter, she didn't think that the prince would lie about this, nor would he have to. She had already been briefed that there might be trouble when Lionel returned, so thinking quick on her feet, she assumed that this was a compromise. Around a corner not far away, Tyrion, who had been prepared to step in to do something, chose to pause instead. Compared to the niceties that Lionel had given him before, this was worth far more. He suddenly found it very difficult to even think of tricking Lionel, let alone doing it. Visit. For the best no____ experience, he shook his head. He felt ridiculous today. He had actually done something as embarrassing as blush. Now this. Not long later, Lionel was escorted out of the mansion under the lead of Avery. Along the way, Avery found herself relaxing even to the point she began to laugh and giggle at the things Lionel said from time to time. She almost forgot that she was meant to be on official business, representing her Dove family. You really have seen a lot of things. My father won't let me off of Earth. I've always wanted to see what the greater universe looks like. Avery had a slight longing in her gaze as she looked up toward the sky. But, unfortunately, there was nothing but an expanse of blue to see. Lionel smiled. I never would have thought that the stoic Grand Prime Minister Dove would actually be so overprotective. It seems that all fathers have a soft spot for their little girls. Avery pouted. I don't want him to have a soft spot. He should treat me like he does Tyrion, but he doesn't take me seriously. The latest __sodies are on the website. Who knows? Maybe Tyrion wishes your father treated him more like he does you. Definitely not. Avery shook her head, her black hair sprinkling about. My big brother is a workaholic. He's been like that even since he was a kid. If it has nothing to do with self-improvement, he wants nothing to do with it. Lionel's brows raised, but he didn't refute Avery. Who was he to correct her views on her family members? She definitely knew them far better than he did. It's only a coincidence that Tyrion is even here right now. If it wasn't for father calling him back, he'd probably be on the coast with everyone else. On the coasts? Lionel asked. All right. You just came back, so you might not know. Most of the young nobles aren't near the imperial capital anymore. They've gone off to the coasts to hunt the oceanic beasts. There've been a lot of them trying to come on land as of late. Not only is their meat really good for strengthening bodies, but their beast crystals sometimes go for exorbitant prices depending on their level. I see. Lionel's lip curled into a smile. Oh, we're here. This is the first prime storefront. We were planning on holding auctions for these in the coming few months, but since father said you can have your pick, feel free. Visit. For a better user experience, the location was indeed perfect. The shop was on a prominent street corner and had a body that wrapped around its edges. No matter what direction you were coming or going from, it would be impossible not to spot this storefront. On top of that, the surrounding ambience was perfect. The smell in the air made one feel relaxed. There was a hint of nature with a park being nearby, but not too close that it would ruin the metropolitan atmosphere, and there was even a bank not too far away in case one ran out of money to spend. Lionel nodded when he saw all of this. No need to go check out the other ones. I don't need more than one storefront anyway. I'll take this. Chapter 978. Chapter 978. Beach. Avery blinked. Lionel really made decisions fast. The truth was that it didn't really matter to Lionel if there was another storefront that was a little bit better than this one. As long as it was close, as he expected they would be, his store would become the most popular among them. In fact, even if he didn't get a prime storefront, it was only a matter of time before his store still reached the top. It would just take a little longer. Do you need me to assign some people of terrain to you? They can help with the upkeep of the store and can also manage it for you. There's a small fee to pay, but it's nothing too great. It made Lionel slightly uncomfortable to hear this, but he knew it was probably the best choice so long as his grandfather followed through on his promise to integrate their later generations as one of their own. No, that won't be necessary. Lionel could just automate everything like he had with his Valiant Mountain store. As long as he upgraded it from time to time and had his people maintain them force arts, there wouldn't be a problem. Avery nodded. All right. Visit. For the best no___ experience, Lionel was about to say something when he suddenly sensed several responses from his talisman. He had sent out quite a few messages earlier and they had finally gathered up. It was about time for him to go. Seems that I have to go now. Tell your elder brother that he can come here in about a week with the specifications for the craft he wants. If you'd like, I can make something for you too. Lionel said with a light smile. Avery was stunned again, but before she could react, a black surfboard had appeared beneath Lionel's feet as he shot into the air. Toward such a thing, Avery could only be speechless. Flying was most definitely prohibited within city limits. This Lionel broke rules left and right without regard for anything. But rather than feeling that he was a pampered prince, Avery couldn't help but smile. It was clear her impression of Lionel was quite good. Oh no, there's so much work to do. A bulb suddenly went off for Avery. She needed to sign over the property in Lionel's name, handle the paperwork for the property and service taxes, and on top of that she needed to get the permit to sell goods from the imperial capital itself. She suddenly felt as though Lionel had saddled her with a whole bunch of work he was oblivious to. It was a whole other can of worms if Lionel planned on opening a crafter's shop. Just think about it, back on 21st century Earth, not just anyone could open up a gun shop or a gun range. It was definitely far more difficult than opening up a restaurant, but even a restaurant needed to meet certain health guidelines. Compared to a gun shop of the 21st century, a crafter's shop was thousands of times more dangerous, and such things had already been taken into account and heavily regulated by the Ascension Empire. Now Avery needed to wade through these waters and handle it all. Visit. For the best no_vil_understood_understanding experience, she pouted her cherry lips, her appearance becoming even more adorable than it was previously. She didn't think Lionel had done it on purpose, but he was really too reckless. Forget it, maybe he knew something since he offered to make me a treasure too. Avery did an about-face and began to stroll back to her family estate, thinking of all the stories of the outside world Lionel had told her about. The air is so salty, my skin is drying out. Alan frowned, his brows furrowing behind his glasses. Stop complaining, for eyes. You're already wearing so many layers of clothes to begin with, how much of your skin is being affected at all? Raj called out. As usual, Alan had buried his perfect physique beneath layers of baggy clothing. Considering they were currently standing on a beach, he looked especially out of place. Though that could be said for all of them. Despite the surroundings, they didn't have the luxury of wearing swim trunks and exposing their torsos. Up ahead, rather than sand meeting water as it usually would, there was an enormous border of steel. Not just that, but the ocean's water was filled with tankers and warships. It was easier to spot a wall of metal than it was to see the blue of the waters. Visit. For a better _user experience, the 8 brothers stood a distance away. If not for this, they wouldn't even have the luxury to stand on sand. It was clear that Earth was taking the defense of its coasts extremely seriously, but if you had seen the kind of monstrosities that were trying to make their way to land, this wouldn't be a great surprise at all. After just a year, the auras of the 8 had grown exponentially. It felt like they could conquer anything. Hey you 8, what are you standing around there for? A modified military jeep drove through the sand, rolling toward the boys. It only took a simple glance at their wrists to know that these 8 came from Earth. However, the soldier was casting them looks of disgust. There were no small number of youths that had come to the coast to show off and say they participated when in reality they would just stand around and avoid danger just like these 8. At least, that was what the man sitting in the passenger seat of the jeep thought initially until he got closer. He didn't recognize them all, but when Arnold cast a glance over toward him, he froze. A memory of Arnold shooting into the air and smashing a 20-meter-tall squid to minced meat with a single palm replayed in his mind. In that moment, his next words couldn't help but get caught in his throat. However, by that point, the 8 young men had already ignored him as they had all locked eyes with another young man who rode the back of the military jeep with a wide grin on his face. The latest _IP_SODIes are on the website. Who else could this man be if not for Lionel? Cap. Chapter 979. Chapter 979 Steroids. Lionel hopped out of the military jeep only to be tackled into a bear hug by Milan. Oof. Though Milan wasn't nearly strong enough to knock the wind out of Lionel, the latter still feigned weakness. Unfortunately, that didn't garner him any sympathy as Milan just squeezed him harder. Before Lionel realized what was happening, he was suddenly dog-piled. In fact, the only 2 who didn't move were Alan and Arnold. The 2 looked toward one another and shook their heads. It seemed that they were in lockstep when it came to matters like this. The driver and passenger of the military jeep looked on incredulously. That was a prince of the empire. What was going on? Since when could you treat a prince like that? Thinking about Prince Noah and how stoic he was, not to mention the cold, short-haired beauty that was always by his side. This Lionel was really too much of a drastic difference from the kind of royalty that they were used to. All right. Lionel muffled groans sounded beneath the 6-man pile. However, they seemed to have no intention of letting him go. Visit. For a better _user experience. Consider this a little punishment for leaving us for so long. Cap. Franco's voice rang through the pile, his big mouth being the first to open. Maybe if he could see Lionel's sly grin from beneath the pile he wouldn't have been so cheeky. Bang. Suddenly, 6 bodies went flying in all directions, flying up and outward completely out of their control and releasing squeals along the way. Lionel rose from the sand with a grin, patting it away from his body and winking toward Arnold and Alan, who seemed to have guessed that things would end this way. "Captain, you're in the 5th dimension already?" Alan shook his head. Last time they met Lionel, he was still in the 3rd and he had already been stronger than them back then. Now he had suddenly leapfrogged them all. Wasn't this a bit too ridiculous? Of course, they had also grown far more powerful in the last year. So, they couldn't compare to their former selves as well. But this was still too much, wasn't it? Raj spat out a huge mouthful of sand, his rotund body rolling out of a massive dune. 5th dimension? That's bullshit, Cap. You can't just shoot up PEDs just cause there's no athletic commission to check on you anymore. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_G experience. Author's note. PEDs are performance-enhancing drugs. Steroids essentially. Oh? I had some for you, but if you don't want it, forget it, forget it. Lionel shook his head and sighed as though he was lamenting something. Fuck that. Give me the drugs. The 6 recovered quickly, surrounding Lionel with their eyes lit up. They didn't need to be a genius to know that Lionel had brought back good things. What happened to doling out punishment? Oh, Cap, you're a broad-minded person, right? You wouldn't fuss over such a little thing, right? Franco's eyes blinked innocently, but the movement of his big ears made it look like his head would fly away any moment now. Lionel laughed. To tell you the truth, I did bring back some good things that should help you get to the quasi-5th dimension very quickly. But you'll still need to see whether your bodies can handle it. While on planet Solara, most of what Lionel had found were precious ores. Most of the herb ore had already been handed to Elther to feed the oryx for the next month. As for the other ores, they had been kept by Lionel for the sake of crafting. However, aside from these ores, near the core of the world, Lionel had found a small patch of force herbs. Visit. For a better user experience for these herbs to grow in such harsh conditions, it wasn't a surprise that they were exceptionally valuable. Lionel had to rely on the dictionary to identify them since plants and such weren't part of his expertise. And he wasn't disappointed in the slightest. They were a 5th dimension herb known as the bone-burning rose. According to the dictionary, in the hands of a force pill crafter, such an herb could be used to cleanse and strengthen the body all the way through to the quasi-6th dimensional level. The bad news was that Lionel wasn't such an expert and Aina was no longer with him. The good news, however, was that there was a cruder method that required blending and diluting the herb with cleansing waters. Though it was a bit of a waste to use the force herb like this, it was for the best. Taking in a 5th dimensional herb of such potency was obviously too difficult for their current bodies. But when diluted like this, it would take just enough edge off. In addition, thanks to the segmented cube's new abilities, as long as he saved a single stock of this force herb, he'd be able to make more of this herb in the future so long as he absorbed enough 5th dimensional force to do so. Something the segmented cube had ample of. That said, according to the dictionary, the best state to take this crude concoction was after being pushed to your very limits. So, Lionel needed to run his brothers through the gauntlet first. Seeing the evil grin on Lionel's face, the 8 suddenly felt a cold wind nip at their necks. They fused the image of the current Lionel with Coach Owen, causing traumatic memories of suicide runs and 40°C weather to resurface in their minds. Just as Lionel was about to explain, his head tilted in a certain direction. In the distance he could see rolling black clouds heading in their direction. They were still several hundred miles away, but Lionel estimated it wouldn't be more than 2 or 3 hours before they made it here. Visit. For a better user experience still, this wasn't what Lionel was looking at. It seemed his cousin was on this coast as well. Chapter 980? Chapter 983 Natural Basins. Lionel smiled as he saw Noah riding over with the daughter of the Grand Prime Minister Scarlet family, Jessica. The two sat on the back of an enormous turtle with an obsidian black shell. It was definitely the case that this creature was being controlled by Jessica's ability, and it was actually well into the 5th dimension as well. Lionel couldn't help but sigh to himself. This was a difference in talent. From what Lionel had seen in the outside world, finding someone who could battle the 5th dimension while being in the 4th was impossible out there. But here was Jessica, who was clearly still within the 4th dimension, using her talent to control a 5th dimensional beast. In that case, couldn't it be said that she could fight across dimensions as well? The people of Earth might have been lacking in their foundation and their dimension level, but as the people of Terrain had learned firsthand, the talent granted to them by their abilities was so great that this gap could be closed. If it wasn't for the fact Lionel's ability was auxiliary and not strictly offensive, his own prowess would be even more exaggerated. Oh, that might not necessarily be true. But Lionel was still a young man. He couldn't help but think that the grass was greener on the other side. As he aged and matured, he would definitely come to realize that his own ability was the most suited to him. If he had been born with an attack-type ability, let alone becoming stronger than he was now, he may very well become weaker. Noah, Jessica. It's good to see you. Lionel greeted with a smile, looking up toward them as they leaped down. Visit. For a better user experience, the two were immediately caught off guard by Lionel's greeting. This was especially so for Noah. Lionel's attitude toward him had always been lukewarm. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact that he was Lionel's cousin, he might have already died at Lionel's hands. Of course, there was a good reason for this. For one, they hadn't grown up together like many cousins would. At the same time, the first time they met was on a battlefield, after Noah tried to kill the woman he presumed Lionel loved. So, it could be said that they had gotten off to a rocky start. The reason Noah had come over despite knowing the strain in their relationship was because he always put duty before his own comfort. He and Lionel were the princes of this generation. If they were on the same coast and yet didn't meet, it would make the people conjure up stories in their mind. If the imperial family wasn't a solid block, how would the empire be whole? However, he had never expected for Lionel to greet him so warmly. It almost caused him to falter. Ah, yes, right. Noah forced a smile of etiquette, his white gold hair fluttering in the salty winds. Is this your cousin, Cap? Wow, I've seen him on live broadcast before. You really are a prince. Raj spoke foolish words as he tended to do, granting him a slap to the back of the head by Milan. What's that supposed to mean? You think Cap lied? Piss off, Raj snarled, rubbing the back of his head. I just meant it's kind of lame. If he was a prince, he should have told us a long time ago. Think about how many noble young women I've missed out on. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Keep dreaming. Even if Cap was emperor, it wouldn't help you get pussy, you tub of lard. Are you trying to go, Milan? I won't let you off easy like your Papa Arnold would. The hell did you say to me? Milan reacted like a cat who had his tail stepped on. Claiming Arnold was his better was definitely a reverse scale of his. Lionel shook his head. It seemed he overthought things about these guys growing stiff in the face of nobility. Let's go over there. These guys have gotten riled up, it seems. Lionel chuckled. I don't know a lot about this coast and how things are set up. Maybe you could clarify some things for me? Noah nodded, having already regained his composure. Yes, I can do that. The pair of cousins began to exchange information, and Lionel quickly gained a picture of just how things worked. When Earth was terraformed, it was designed with this day in mind, Noah explained. Though we combined all 7 continents, the truth is that Earth's mainland only has the equivalent land of about a third of that. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel nodded. He knew this as he was taught in school. But, it was always explained away as a necessary trade-off, not something that was done out of necessity like Noah was explaining it now. Lionel could immediately think of several possibilities now that it had been brought to his attention, one of which Noah began to describe soon after. The remaining 2/3 of land was left to form underwater defensive measures. As Earth evolved beyond the 3rd dimension, those mechanisms will only become stronger with time. The first line of defense are the 3 natural basins. Essentially, most of the main continent is surrounded by shallow water not surpassing about 20 meters in depth. Essentially, powerful marine creatures avoid these areas as they're not deep enough to live in. These shallow waters stretch out for hundreds of miles from the coast and can essentially be counted as purposely flooded lands. Lionel's gaze narrowed. This was indeed a great defensive option. Even in the rare instance a powerful creature did make a move there, it would be easily handled. The 3 natural basins are the only locations surrounding the continent where this rule is broken. Not only are the waters not shallow, they're even purposely deep. Even right up into the coast, the water is as much as half a kilometer deep. An oceanic beast might not even realize they were approaching the coast as a result of this. These basins are shaped like water droplets with a narrow coast and a wide base. This allows many creatures in, but they begin to crowd the nearer they get to the coast. This leaves us with only about 100 miles to defend. We are currently at one of the 3 natural basins, the Royal Blue Basin. Lionel shook his head. His grandfather was an extraordinary genius. This wasn't something he could deny any longer. The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. Chapter 981. Chapter 981 Storm, is it fine for the both of us to be here? Lionel suddenly asked. His reasoning was fairly sound. It seemed that Emperor Fox was once again leaving these matters up to the younger generation mostly. However, Lionel and Noah were most definitely two of the most talented youths Earth had to offer. To send them to defend the same natural basin seemed like overkill. Lionel had picked to come here only because his brothers were here. But it wouldn't be much of an issue to move toward another natural basin before matters really began to get out of hand. Surprisingly, though, Noah shook his head. No, it's probably good that you're here. The northern and southern natural basins have an extra layer of defenses that come with the ice caps that surround them. The Royal Blue Natural Basin is the only one that has truly open waters, and due to the more favorable temperatures there are a wider range of species in this region as well. Lionel nodded. He hadn't been certain of where the other basins were as everything was underwater and well hidden. But if things were like this, it was perfect. This was definitely the most dangerous of the basins. Plus, if something went wrong with the other basins, Lionel was certain that he could get there in a timely fashion. Sounds good. Lionel nodded before suddenly smiling toward Jessica. Jessica, right? If I had to guess, your Scarlet family probably controls Black City? Jessica blinked, shocked by the sudden change in the conversation. However, she didn't seem to grow as flustered as Noah, her emotions remaining even and calm. Visit. For the best no underserved experience, yes. Why do you ask? Just a guess. Lionel smiled, not explaining himself. He still hadn't decided whether it would be worth it to build another shop or not. It might just be an extra headache for no reason. Another storm is coming. Noah's gaze narrowed. By now, the black clouds Lionel had seen earlier were visible even to those who didn't have his senses. Considering Noah's serious expression, it seemed to be something that occurred every so often. Has this happened before? Lionel asked. It happens at least once a day now, sometimes twice. We think that there might be some high-level oceanic beast with a storm ability that's directing this. Directing? When Lionel thought of Little Black Star's intelligence, he didn't think that such a thing would be impossible. But the question was why? With enough intelligence to direct other beasts of its kind, shouldn't this creature also be smart enough to know that the Earth's surface wasn't a place it would live happily? It's actually quite intelligent. It could be said that among the oceanic beasts it directs, at least 80% are invalids. We think that it's using us to rid its kingdom of these scourges. Visit. For the best no _vel_underscored_g experience, Lionel's pupils constricted. It seemed that this answered his question perfectly. He had never seen an invalid from another species, but this was a good chance to saturate the silver tablet. Lionel still hadn't forgotten that the silver tablet needed such high and pure level force to function. What better target than a whole horde of invalids coming to deliver themselves to him? Even if he wouldn't get as many beast crystals as he was hoping for, this was a good opportunity nonetheless. Just 80%? Lionel suddenly realized an oddity. If this creature had perfect control, wouldn't it be 100%? That likely meant that this was something different from true control. Noah nodded, understanding Lionel. The storm is a bit special. It seems to accumulate a lot of the force from the death of the invalids before concentrating them into clouds. Then, it rains down what seems to be a rain infused with high concentrations of force. This is registered like a small force eruption. Invalids are the most sensitive to such changes, but normal oceanic creatures, so long as they're close enough to the coast, will sense it as well. Lionel inwardly chuckled, suddenly remembering a battle he had with a particular octopus years ago. That was back during the days just absorbing force could send a whole host of invalids to kill you. Lionel had been particularly unlucky back then as a real beast from the sea came after him while he was carrying Aina on his back. So this beast is quite stingy. Not only is it making us fight its battles, but it's not letting us benefit from the force of the invalids either. Visit. For the best no _vel_g experience, Lionel had to admit that it was the perfect plan. It seemed that the humans weren't the only ones who had schemers among them. But Lionel really wanted to see which was better at absorbing force. The ability of this mysterious oceanic beast? Or the silver tablet? It's coming. Noah looked toward Jessica and nodded, hopping back onto the back of the obsidian turtle. Lionel walked back toward his teammates, his mind spinning. He almost didn't notice when he stood amidst them. When he looked up and met their gazes, he suddenly grinned as a rip of thunder boomed across the skies. Let's go. Lionel shot into the distance, 8 of his brothers following closely behind him. A line of golden energy followed him. The instant he reached the edge of the beach, he jumped, the ground beneath his feet trembling as he shot up, landing on the first enormous cruiser and continuing to blaze a path forward. In just a few seconds, the group of 9 had made it to the very vanguard, standing at the helm of a cruiser ship and watching as the ocean waves slowly became more violent, the lush blue waters darkening to the point they became an inky black. At that moment, the howl of a beast shook the skies. Visit. For a better user experience, a blue whale the size of 3 cruisers stacked front to back shot out of the waters. One of its white eyes locked onto them as it rolled in the skies, a blank sort of greed hidden within. Then it smashed down onto the surface of the ocean, causing a wave that rose up 200 meters to blanket their sights. Chapter 982. Chapter 982 Competition. Hold. The roar of an admiral thundered in Lionel's ears. This region was under the control of Unit 7, which was under the command of Tier 7 Admiral Ellie. As one of the 3 central pillars of this natural basin, he was unfazed by this rolling wave and hardly reacted to the sudden appearance of Lionel and his brothers. As far as Admiral Ellie was concerned, the main backbone of this defense was and always would be the military. He would let these youths do as they pleased, but he would continue to command things as though they weren't there. The day he relied on these talents would be the day he died an early death. The 200-meter-tall wave seemed to cover all things. But this was hardly the most fearsome part of it. Hidden within, a whole host of carnivorous fish baring their teeth and beady little white eyes wiggled about, shooting forward outside of their control. However, while they might have struggled initially, when they caught the scent of fresh meat coming their way, they completely stopped. They rode the wave, a menacing killing intent bearing down on the souls of those on the backs of the cruisers. By now, many of the youths who had come here for fame and glory had long since taken a back seat. This wasn't the first storm they were experiencing, and they realized that they were in way over their heads. At least some of them anyway. With this shedding of the weak, all those who stepped forward now were the cream of the crop. Despite the looming death wave that hung over him, Lionel turned his head to the side, and locked eyes with a young man standing at the helm of a cruiser to his left. Much like Lionel, he too ignored the wave, having glanced toward Lionel's direction. Visit. For a better user experience, if Lionel had to describe this young man in one word, it would be vampire. If he had to describe him in 2, it would be handsome vampire. The young man was as thin as a pole, but had extraordinarily broad shoulders. His skin was an almost sickly pale color, as though he had just risen from a coffin, and he stood at nearly 7 feet tall. As though that wasn't damning enough, he had long fluttering black hair that reached the small of his back, shimmering crimson eyes, and a nose and jawline so sharp that they could cut glass. The young man, seeing that Lionel was looking at him, smiled lightly. He crossed an arm across his chest and bowed slightly, a formal greeting of nobility. It was clear that he recognized Lionel as a prince and was adequately respectful considering the circumstances. Lionel smiled as well, returning the gesture. This was his very first time meeting someone from the moon. It seemed that they lived up to their reputation. Let alone the young man, all the youths that followed him had exceptionally pale complexions and tall statures. Even the women were well over 6 feet tall. Despite being separated by almost 300 meters, Lionel and the young man interacted as though they weren't more than 3 meters apart. The young man took this especially seriously as he actually began to mouth words toward Lionel. For Lionel, it was child's play to read the lips of someone. He immediately understood what this young man was saying. A competition, huh? Lionel grinned, gazing toward the people with the young man. He just so happened to have 8 people following him as well. All right, Carolus. I accept. Carolus' smile brightened. All around him, the air began to crack like shattered glass, causing Lionel's gaze to narrow. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, what a powerful spatial ability. Carolus' excitement alone seemed to cause the world to tremble and crack at its seams. He didn't seem impacted by the fact this was among the most sturdy 5th-dimensional worlds there was. You heard him, boys. What do you say? Lionel's aura changed, his pale violet eyes blazing to life. Hold. Admiral Ellie roared again. In that same moment, Arnold slapped his palms together. The sound was so loud that even the claps of thunder above were drowned out. Universal force blazed to life around him. Lionel grinned. Carolus grinned. Without a word, their teams shot out, the 2 young men still staring each other down as though they hadn't noticed the change behind themselves at all. Arnold took the helm, his strength soaring as his enormous body bolted through the air. His muscles rippled, his shirt shattering as though it was made out of glass and not pliable fabric. Whether it was his broad back or chest, it was filled with striations that shook one to their core. He rose his large palms into the air, universal force swirling about him. In one moment, everything seemed normal. In the next, a massive palm of energy suddenly manifested, swinging downward with a momentum that could crush all things toward the wave. Visit. For the best no_well_underscored_ng experience opposite Arnold, a young lady had also jumped into the air. Joyce's aura flourished, her tiny fists tucking against her body before shooting out like blazing meteors. At first, the energies that coated them were just the same size as the fist they came from. But, in the blink of an eye, it multiplied to a size that matched Arnold's palm. Bang, 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 bang. In an instant, a wave that rose up more than 200 meters was crushed. Two holes, one shaped like a palm and another shaped like a fist, tore through, taking with it hundreds of carnivorous fish. At that very moment, both Lionel and Carolus stretched out a palm. The two never took their eyes off of one another, but it was as though they could already see the blue whale on the other side of the two holes. Space shattered around Carolus' palm while a massive shield of translucent gold crystal formed before Lionel's. The world fell into absolute silence for a moment before a beam of grayish-black and a laser of bright white gold tore through it all. The blue whale that had risen into the skies again, intent on sending another wave forward, froze in the air. For a moment, it seemed as though nothing had happened, the world entering a state of stillness. But then it happened. Two enormous, bloody holes were torn through the blue whale's body. In the blink of an eye, it had lost 99% of its head, leaving nothing but a thin film of flesh and gore that had been the distance separating Lionel and Carolus' attack. Bang. Visit. For the best no_well_underscored_ng experience, the blue whale fell back to the ocean, dyeing the surface crimson. Just 2 chapters for today, June 20th, 22. Chapter 983. Chapter 983 beginning. The blue whale's corpse caused another enormous wave to shoot upward. However, the 16 men and women had long since been prepared, shooting through the holes Arnold and Joyce created to face the next oncoming curtain of black water. Drake took out a twin pair of pistols as he landed on the surface of the water, a layer of force protecting the soles of his feet. A twinkle lit in his eye when he raised them up, exuding an air of confidence the rookie hadn't had before. Ziggy, Ziggy, Ziggy. His fingers began to move in rapid succession, causing another projectile to flash outward with every squeeze of the trigger. It felt as though he had the entire world within his domain. Every single one of his shots, without fail, pincered the brow of a carnivorous fish. It didn't seem to matter whether they were hiding deep within the black waters, nor did it matter that their images were distorted. None of it could escape Drake. The other 7 dropped down along with him. This time Milan took the helm, a deep snort erupting from the depths of his chest. "You think you can just blow a single hole through the wave and call it a day, Arnold?" Milan's deep rumbling voice shook the waves beneath his feet, his force rising to an unprecedented degree. He and the group behind him began to sink down as more and more of the dark waters were pushed to the side. Visit. For the best no_well_underscored_ng experience. At that moment, an enormous energy shield of silver shot out with Milan's body at the center. At first it was just barely 1.8 meters tall. But, in the next instant, it ballooned to over 300 meters tall and wide, dwarfing the second oncoming wave. Bang, bang, bang. The wall of black water was completely stone-walled, crashing against Milan's energy shield and even reflecting back with such force that a tsunami formed in the retreating direction. With a wink, the energy shield vanished and the moon youths shot forward as well, smiling in Milan's direction as though to give him thanks. "He'll take a date with any one of you beauties as repayment," Milan called out through the rumbling storm. Joyce snorted. "You're too short for any one of us." An uproarious laughter came from Milan's back the moment these words fell. Raj and the rest were practically wheezing. The latest _p_sodies are on the website. Milan wasn't exactly short, but he was a tick beneath 6 feet tall. He was just more stocky than he was gifted height-wise. This made him the perfect size for anchoring an offensive line at the center. But, to think he would be looked down upon like this. Another young lady who went by the name Alina winked in Milan's direction, clearly siding with Joyce on this matter. Her light giggles penetrated Milan's heart, causing it to crack and shatter. The only thing he was missing was a single tear rolling down his face. "Damn it!" Milan roared. He'll show you all the prowess of a short king. Keep up first. Joyce called out, already having separated them by a distance of 50 meters. Every time her fist flashed, an abyssal hole would form on the water's surface, mincing the fish that were just below into minced meat. Soon after, a whirlpool of surging black waters would form. The result was the ocean's surface growing more and more volatile every passing moment. The tsunami Milan had just reflected back began to roll backward, but the group of 16 was completely unfazed, their synergy only seeming to increase with every exchange. Alina's delicate feet touched the surface of the water. In the blink of an eye, several spiraling water javelins formed around her. And yet, they reflected with such clarity that it almost looked as though they were instead polished works of black glass. However, as beautiful as they were even more deadly. These javelins shot forward, skewering the carnivorous fish. In fact, every one seemed to reap the lives of at least 2 or 3. Though not as devastating as Joyce's fists, they were much faster and there was an endless supply all around. Visit. For the best no_undershield experience, just when it seemed that the tsunami would come back to wipe them out, Alina stretched a hand forward, causing the rolling waters to stop in its tracks. The fish within began to whine and struggle, suddenly finding it difficult to move within. Then, in a motion that could only be described as casual, Alina squeezed her palm shut. There was no eruption of blood, no shocking screech. There was just a sudden vacant noise. A chattering of teeth that they had gotten used to, knowing it was coming from the carnivorous fish, vanished. If it wasn't for the rumbling thunder above and the rain that was slowly beginning to fall on the battlefield, the silence would be pregnant. Milan's roar was cut short by this sight as he stared at Alina's back view. He looked as though he had been shocked out of his wits. He pressed his lips together, seemingly too scared to say anything more. At least, that was what it seemed like before his pursed lips began to whistle. "Hey tall beauty, wait for me." Milan suddenly called out, shooting forward. "Forget him, I've got the height you want." Raj called out. "And you've got the flub she doesn't." Milan chided without looking back. The group shot ahead together, their momentum only growing as though they were just getting started. Visit. For the best no_undershield experience by this point, their display had already raised the morale of the Ascension Empire military by a great deal. It wasn't just them but the youths who had come here to display their talents also felt emboldened. There were more than 100 kilometers worth of coast to defend, so it wasn't surprising in the least that there were many other groups displaying the same kind of valor. Lionel's brothers and these moon youths were as well. However, as the rain began slowly picking up from a drizzle to a storm, and eventually becoming a torrential downpour that made it difficult even to see a meter ahead of yourself, it became very obvious, very quickly, that this was just the very beginning. Chapter 984. Chapter 984. Which? Lionel and Carolus still stood facing one another, a light smile on their faces. It felt as though the torrential rain couldn't stop them, nor did it seem to touch even the hem of their clothing. A seemingly delicate barrier surrounded the both of them. Lionel's looked like a halo of golden light while Carolus looked like arcs of grayish-black lightning which were, in truth, just the shattered glass of space. For now, all the fish that had come were barely B-grade within the 4th dimension, and that was only if the blue whale was part of the equation. As for the carnivorous fish, they were D-grade at best. To the current Lionel, and apparently to Carolus as well, even an SSS-grade existence within the 4th dimension would be child's play. So it was no wonder they had yet to move just yet. What Lionel found fascinating, though, was the fact the energy source of the blue whale really hadn't come to them. Though Lionel didn't seem to be paying attention to the battlefield, he truly was. He had easily seen that the stream of lights the blue whale had become had sunk down instead. This made it impossible to tell whether it was Lionel or Carolus who had landed the finishing blow on the oceanic beast. At that moment, when the rain seemed to reach its peak, several domes of water began to form in the water. It looked as though several looming waterfalls were forming, but none had a sheer cliff to fall from. These domes continued to rise, large swaths of water falling the top. Lionel's gaze shifted from Carolus to these domes of water. In the blink of an eye, several dozen had formed. Soon there were hundreds. Visit. For a better user experience, someone with lesser senses would have thought that this was some sort of apocalyptic ability, but Lionel immediately saw through it all. Each one of those domes of water were enormous creatures of impossible sizes, and they had all come at once. As though affirmation was triggered by Lionel's thoughts, the first large discs of white formed. Amidst the darkening storm, the white irises of the invalid creatures shimmered like blinding lighthouses. Each one was 5 meters tall all on their own. Nothing needed to be said for just how large the bodies of such creatures were if their eyes were so enormous. Now things are getting interesting. Lionel's lip curled. Plus, if I didn't go out now, how am I supposed to steal this energy from this greedy beast? The disk of gold crystal still hovered by Lionel's hand. It was no surprise that this was refractive gold. Now that Lionel was in the 5th dimension, manifesting the ores he had used to build the foundation of his body in the 4th dimension was as easy as breathing. With it, he could make a casual flicker of light into a beam that could eradicate an enormous creature with a thought, allowing him to use the same concept his sniper rifle used with much more flexibility. With a glance back toward Carolus, Lionel left him a smile before they both shot out. Lionel stepped into the air, plates of earth manifesting with his thoughts. Visit. For the best no_undershinji experience. As for Carolus, he too stepped into the air. However, what was shocking was that his steps caused cracks of space to form. It was like he was stepping on space itself to ascend into the skies, a sight that showed just the level of control he had over his spatial affinity. At the same time as these two moved, no small number of others who deemed themselves to be on the same level did so as well. Among these there was of course Jessica and Noah. Lionel, though, wasn't thinking about these individuals at all. He truly wanted to see just what sort of creature he was up against. The heads of the creatures finally rose up completely, the last of the water falling from their skulls to reveal colossal squids with bulbous heads that shimmered with various shades of pink to violet. Lionel's gaze flashed, several plates of refractive gold appearing around him to total 9. Not a single one was more than foot wide. But they alone exuded a murderous aura so potent that it felt like everyone around Lionel should retreat as far as possible. Like this, Lionel stood in the skies having swapped in his plate of earth for his black surfboard. His hair danced about in the wind as the torrential rain seemed to wrap around him, not touching a single inch of his clothing. A hand rested in his pockets while the other stretched outward, causing the 9 shields of refractive gold to rotate about in a circle before him. Visit. For a better _user experience SHUU. In that moment, a beam of golden light tore through the skies, piercing the head of a colossal squid. Compared to the enormous size of the creature, it looked no different from a needle poking at a human. And yet, the eyes of the colossal squid seemed to dim. What once was a gaze as bright as a lighthouse faded and the creature began to collapse. However, before it could even hit the dark waters, it turned into motes of light. Lionel seemed to have almost not noticed the change at all. His 9 shields of refractive gold rotated once. The result was another beam of gold tearing its way forward. With every rotation, another colossal squid fell. They seemed to not even get the chance to attack before they were mowed down. As though a human machine gun, Lionel glided through the skies. His every action reaped another life. At this point even Carolus' lip was twitching. It had only been a single minute but Lionel had already taken out over 60 of the colossal squids. What kind of competition was this, exactly? He could tell that Lionel was making it look so easy because he was pinpointing their crystals and shattering them with a single strike. But, if it was so easy to find such a thing within such an enormous body, wouldn't everyone be doing it? Visit. For a better _user experience, the skies became so saturated with so much 4th dimensional force that it almost forced the darkening clouds back into believing it was daytime once again. It was then that Lionel took out a shimmering silver tablet, a smirk creeping up on his face. Which one will win? The silver tablet? Or you? Chapter 985. Chapter 985 Reawaken? The result was beyond Lionel's expectations. Though he had expected the silver tablet to win out, he hadn't expected the result to be so exaggerated. Let alone the force of the invalids, it felt as though all the force of the world had suddenly surged toward him. In fact, he felt that much the same way this mysterious creature had somehow gained the ability to break the rules of the universe, so too could this tablet snatch the force of invalids others had killed. I see. With a bit of conscious thought, the tablet seemed to react to Lionel's wants, only snatching up the force provided by the squids he had defeated. With his speed he didn't feel like he needed to snatch from others. The results spoke for themselves. Every step Lionel took through the air, another colossal squid would fall without even a chance to fight back for even a single moment. From below his teammates shook their heads. What a show-off. Look at that, my tall beauties are looking at Cap with such sparkling eyes. This has to be classified as discrimination. Milan looked as though he had lost his soul. The latest _p_sodies are on _ the website. He continued to use his energy shields to rip large amounts of fish out of the water for Drake to snipe out in a single breath. As they tag-teamed a wing, Joel and Gil tag-teamed another. Gil sent out arcs of lightning, shocking the large swaths of fish until they were frozen. Following up, Joel sent out strikes of his halberd, skewering them dead with his lethal blade chi. Without large amounts of earth around him, Raj probably experienced the greatest drop-off in his strength upon stepping out into these open waters. But he had come prepared. Large amounts of metal shavings hung around him almost like metallic sand. With a thought, this black sand would solidify into drill bits, even hardening to the point they shimmered like diamond. Raj's skill in fluctuating the hardness of the earth his controlled had grown exponentially. He could go to and from the quality of earth he wielded depending on the situation, even up to the point he could now control these fine earth particles to act at his whim. Even though his fat jiggled with his every action, each one was still purposeful and powerful. A swing of his arm came with several tons of shimmering diamond, crushing the fish that stood in his way with impunity. Arnold's actions were just as if not even more overbearing. While Joyce was leaving whirlpools with her every punch, he left trenches that split the ocean in two. The oceanic beasts were being put through a grinder. But they were also steadily growing more powerful. Soon, the concentration of S and SS grade fourth-dimensional beast increased from 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 100. Eventually, it became 1 in 50. Visit. For a better user experience when things reached this point, the group of 16 could no longer push forward with naked abandon. Getting surrounded just once with such powerful creatures would be the equivalent to a death sentence. Though many of them were confident in taking on even fifth-dimensional creatures, the battle reaching this point meant that the true challenge was coming. Lionel had never taken his senses completely away from his teammates. But he didn't go to support them either. Though he was taking out these SS and SSS-grade colossal squids one after another, that was about all he was doing for them. If they didn't reach the very end of their limits, they wouldn't be able to absorb the bone-burning roast properly. Lionel looked down at the tablet again, sending his senses into it. By now, he had taken out over 200 of the colossal squid in barely a few minutes. There were no lack of eyes on him as a result of this, but he acted as though he didn't notice at all. On the Unit 7 cruiser, Admiral Ellie was especially speechless. His unit hadn't even gotten a chance to do anything yet. All he could yell out every so often was "hold." It had to be said that these cruisers didn't work on third-dimensional technology. Rather, they were designs created after studying the wreckage of the Shield Cross-Stars airship and were fueled by force crystals. The innovation of Earth truly shouldn't be underestimated. The confidence that everyone had for dealing with the inevitable fifth-dimensional creatures that would be coming were on the basis of these cruisers. To Lionel, though, it was too great a waste of treasures. Earth, no matter how much they had prepared, lacked proper force crafters. In order to make up a gap of skill, they used brute force instead. With the amount of resources they had poured into a single cruiser, let alone a cruiser that could face fifth-dimensional existences, Lionel could make one that could damn near eradicate a sixth-dimensional existence. That said, Lionel felt that this matter wasn't so simple as it seemed. If his grandfather had truly planned out everything for this moment, and even managed to somehow take a woman from a sixth-dimensional family as a wife, could it really be he didn't know to train a unit of force crafters? Visit. For the best no_underscored_undershinji experience, Lionel felt like every time he understood Earth and his grandfather, he would only simply be peeling back another layer of mystery. Lionel shook his head before his expression brightened. Those over 200 colossal squid he had killed had accumulated enough force to awaken someone from the tablet. It seems to only be enough to awaken someone who didn't die, though. If I want to awaken someone who died in the zone, I'll need. Lionel's happy mood faded. From what he could see, he would need somewhere between 500 to 1,000 times the amount of force he had accumulated now to awaken a single dead comrade. But that person would be only the most normal of soldiers. If he wanted to awaken a talent like his good friend Rollin, he would need as much as 10,000 times the amount he had now. As for a supreme talent like the pure speedster Normand, he would need nearly 100,000 times. Lionel exhaled a long breath when his head suddenly snapped in a particular direction. Gem? The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. Chapter 986. Chapter 986 Crimson Lightning. Lionel suddenly sensed a strong surge. He could immediately tell that this aura was doing its best to snatch up the force that he had taken away. But the sudden change suddenly made a line toward where this suction was coming from clear and obvious. Without hesitation, Lionel shot into the distance. Before anyone could react to what he was doing, he had already shot over the horizon and disappeared into the storm. "Captain." Joel called out to try to get Lionel to come back, but it was already too late. A frown immediately marred his brows. "Damn it." Careless stopped in the air as well. Beneath his feet, space fractured and cracked, causing the colossal squid beneath him to shatter as though it was made of glass. His lethality wasn't to be questioned. Maybe if it wasn't for the fact he couldn't use long-ranged attacks as freely as Lionel could, he wouldn't have fallen so far behind in their competition. But even he couldn't help but frown about Lionel's actions. There wasn't a single soul here who didn't think that Lionel was being far too reckless. There was a reason the basin was formed the way it was and why the cruisers and defenses were positioned as such. Leaving this place was akin to a death sentence. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_g experience without the basin to funnel creatures, those oceanic beasts no longer had to deal with crowding. However, that was just the tip of the iceberg. The most dangerous location was the choke point where the basin began. It was there that these creatures would realize that the ocean wasn't so wide and endless any longer, and they began to be funneled. The result of these was a large accumulation of powerful oceanic beasts stuck outside waiting for their turn to charge in. To those creatures, the appearance of Lionel would be like a flame to a moth. There was a reason the creatures started small and slowly got bigger and bigger as the battle went on. This was because it was easiest for these small creatures to squeeze through, leaving the true behemoths stuck on the outside. Lionel was playing with his life. To these creatures, even jumping several kilometers into the air wasn't a problem in the slightest. And many of them were talents that would have various abilities that would allow them to fly, not much unlike Lionel himself and Careless. He was really dancing on death's blade. He must have sensed it. I sensed it too, but I wasn't able to lock on quickly enough. It seems his senses are more powerful than mine. Careless frowned, not because Lionel had bettered him, but rather because even he wasn't confident in delving into a sea of creatures like that, at least not until he reached the 5th dimension and the restrictions on his ability loosened. Visit. For a better user experience, he gripped his fists. I need to enter soon. His father had told him that Earth would likely face another war very soon. In fact, their enemies might very well be bearing down already. He couldn't afford to be slow. Lionel continued to shoot forward. He had in fact heard Joel's call. But everyone was still underestimating him, quite frankly. With his senses, he could blanket hundreds of kilometers with his internal sight. Let alone having to be warned, he could see the danger up ahead live and in person. There was no surprise waiting for him. But if he could kill this creature, he would effectively solve all of Earth's problems in one sweep. He too could tell that there was likely war looming over the horizon. They couldn't afford to split their attention like they were currently. On the one hand, this was a good way of training up warriors. But on the other, if this went on too long, especially without those fighting on the coast being able to absorb the force the invalids released, it would be a detriment rather than a positive. Visit. For the best no_vel_g experience, Lionel's refractive gold shields continued to rotate as he flew. Large octopus arms and flying swordfish competed to swat him out of the skies and skewer him, but he dodged them with a deft ease, shooting out a single golden beam to kill them all. At first, these flashes of gold were all that told those he had left behind that he was still alive. But very soon he had grown too far away for even those blinding lights to reach them. The rain and the darkness was too much to see through. As Lionel tore a path through the skies, allowing the silver tablet to swallow up the force he earned, the creatures only seemed to grow more powerful. The first quasi-fifth-dimensional creature appeared and its aura seemed to tower over the others. The shark sat menacingly in the waters, the surrounding 10 meters around it completely empty of other creatures. It had deep crimson eyes and was actually the first non-invalid Lionel had run across. Sparks of what looked like blood-drenched lightning coursed around its fin. Every so often, a spark would light the black waters around it, resulting in a sizzling fog that quickly vanished into the air. Lionel had planned on just shooting over this creature, but when he saw this odd, corrosive lightning, his interest was piqued. He wondered if Gil could evolve his lightning if he used the shark's beast crystal. Though Gil was a speedster due to the fact it was element-based, he gained lightning affinity along with it. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Right now, Gil only used normal natural lightning force. But this blood-red lightning seemed to be at least top 100 among lightning elemental forces in Lionel's estimation. Plus, I need to gather up some high-quality meat for everyone to eat. I can't skip over these creatures. Making a decision, Lionel rose a hand. But he was shocked to find that the instant he did, the menacing glare of the shark vanished as it turned tail and ran. Chapter 987. Chapter 987 Size Lionel was shocked for a moment before he chuckled. It seemed that this beast had already realized it stood no chance. Unfortunately for it, it likewise stood no chance of running away either. Lionel shot downward, weaving through the several suction-cupped arms of the enormous octopuses and squids in the surroundings. The jet-black surfboard touched the surface of the water, shooting after the shark. However, seemingly realizing that it was being chased, the shark dove into the sea, diving downward as it continued to swim away. Lionel's gaze narrowed, but he also dove downward without hesitation. That said, he wasn't completely unprepared. He pressed his palms forward, causing 4 triangular sheets of fourth-dimensional star core to form. They pressed together, forming a prism without a base and allowing Lionel to drill into the ocean. It shot forward with such speed that an air pocket formed right behind it, leaving Lionel untouched. At the same time, the 9 shield of refractive gold shattered beneath the water pressure and speed. Unfortunately, the reason the Lionel had to rotate the gold crystal shield to begin with rather than just continuously using one was because he had to repair them after each use. After all, refractive gold was a 4th dimensional, or while Lionel's light elemental force was in the 5th dimension. The fact that it could even survive a single beam was a testament to Lionel's crafting skill in choosing the perfect crystal structure. But now that Lionel was rushing forward like this, their fragility was exposed. In addition, Lionel knew that the beams of light he produced with the shields wouldn't be enough to kill this shark. That was why he hadn't even tried. It was fine for dealing with cannon fodder of the 4th dimension, but a creature so close to the 5th dimension, especially one that was living like this, was a completely different story. Luckily, Star Core was known for its sturdiness, allowing Lionel to keep up the speed. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_ng experience, he caught up to the shark at the point they were already 100 meters below surface level. A spear appeared in his hand and a low roar left his lips. The moment it did, a surge of force shot out from Lionel's body, causing a sphere of air to appear around him as all the water in the surroundings was forced away. The shark suddenly found itself like a fish out of water, gasping for breath without recourse. It fell through the air pocket, flailing about. Unable to fight back, it could only watch as Lionel severed its head from the rest of its body. What a large shark. The shark was at least 50 meters long. Lionel wasn't exactly a marine biologist, but he knew enough to know that creatures of this size should be rare, even in the sea. And yet, it felt like they were suddenly everywhere now. It seemed like the best explanation was that this was just the result of the increasing dimensions on beasts, but why was it that little black star hadn't increased in size? And why was it that humans didn't seem to grow larger either? At least not to such an exaggerated extent anyway. Lionel shook his head, quickly catching the shark and allowing it into the segmented cube before the walls of water closed in around him again. He quickly shot upward with his prism of star core leading the way once more. Lionel's gaze narrowed just as he was about to reach the surface. With a flick of his fingers, his star core prism split, a rush of water threatening to crush him the instant it did. But he was prepared for this long ago. With a clench of his fists, Lionel sent a punch surging with universal force flying forward. Visit. For the best no_understanding experience. Bang. 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 The column of water shattered. At the same time, 4 blade-like pieces of star core shot out, slicing apart tens of oceanic beasts into minced meat as Lionel rose back into the skies, a rain of blood that soon turned to motes of light hovering around him. Lionel flipped over his palm, causing a large beast crystal to appear. Its insides flickered with a wild red lightning that made Lionel narrow his eyes. Maybe I underestimated this force. Top 100 might just be a minimum. The force was weak to him because it was still 4th dimensional and it had come from a beast he easily killed. But this was mostly because Lionel himself was in the 5th dimension. This had little to do with the actual strength of the lightning. After all, not every force could be as powerful as his Scarlet Star force, capable of injuring those even dimensions above it. The fact that this lightning could catch his eye at all was a testament to its strength. Lionel nodded and put the beast crystal away. Even if he didn't end up giving it to Gil, he still hadn't forgotten that he had mainly come here to earn money to begin with. That said, Lionel had a feeling that the beast crystal of the creature controlling all of this would be far more valuable. Lionel tore a path into the distance but very quickly came to a stop again. What he saw this time left him speechless. A beaver the size of a mountain. A crocodile that dwarfed a blue whale. A black swan twice his own height. Swordfish so numerous they formed several formations of their own. Ravenous carnivorous fish led by a rainbow-scaled piranha that looked like it could be its own island. This sort of lineup was enough to make anyone go numb, but Lionel was speechless because of something completely different. Visit. For a better user experience, this creature is actually so cowardly. I'm still hundreds of miles from its locations and yet it already sent this sort of vanguard after me? Lionel knew now that the creature couldn't move far from the location he sensed it from, or else the storm would disperse. That much made sense. But it actually didn't even wait for Lionel to get remotely close for it to send these freaks of nature after him. The only way for these creatures to have gotten here now was for them to have been sent the instant that creature felt Lionel lock onto it. For this creature to actually sense Lionel's internal sight was one matter. Even when Lionel was in the third dimension, no one could do that. And yet, this creature had, even though Lionel was currently in the fifth dimension. Secondly, for the creature to react like this only had two explanations. Either it hated taking risks or it was cowardly to an extreme. How could Lionel not be speechless? To make matters more shocking, Lionel had yet to run into a single fifth-dimensional beast in his time here, but there were suddenly hundreds of them before him now, including the school of endless swordfish. At least they're all Tier 1? Lionel was about to learn very quickly that a Tier 1 talent from Earth meant something far different than a Tier talent from the worlds he had been running around on recently. A Tier 1 talent from a world like this that also happened to be a beast? Well, that was another sort of death sentence altogether. It could be said that everyone was perfectly correct that Lionel had gone out seeking to die. The latest _IP_SODIES are on the website. At that moment, the mountain-sized beaver suddenly raised its flat tail. In that instant, Lionel's pupils constricted into pinholes. Chapter 988. Chapter 988 Mountainous Creature Shit. Just the wind pressure of the beaver's tail alone almost sent Lionel flying into the distance. He realized at that moment alone that a Tier 1 expert that shared his size was completely different from a Tier 1 expert that was so large. That much power scaled to a body that large was obscene on several levels. And that didn't even consider just how much more talented they were than other beasts of their kind to begin with. Bang. It was like someone had suddenly slammed a frying pan with a 50-meter diameter onto the surface of the water. The waves immediately shot into the skies. Whatever darkness there had already been was instantly plunged into an even darker state of blackness. Whereas there was still a flash of color previously due to lightning streaking through the skies, at this moment, it was as though Lionel had fallen into an abyss. Water seemed harmless to most people, but that was only because of the usual state it was run across in. However, it couldn't be forgotten that water had its own weight and could very easily become among the most dangerous materials in the world given the right circumstances. Lionel saw this wave as hardly any different from how a normal human would see a palm swipe from a grizzly bear. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience without hesitation, Lionel immediately activated his bronze runes and donned his silver divine armor. Reflecting beneath the blacks, the silver gained a dark hue to it that gave it a sinister vibe. The instant his visor covered his gaze, the surfboard beneath Lionel's feet vanished as he truly stepped into the air. His body blinked and vanished, appearing past the tall wave and above the beaver. With a spin of his spear, his universal force and spear force surged, the golden mark of a spear appearing to hover before the forehead of his helmet. However, before Lionel could even attempt to end the beaver's life, he felt several dangerous auras lock onto him. Lionel could hardly react as dozens of swordfish shot out from the dark water. They pierced through the heavily falling rain and the fog of darkness like cutting blades. They were so fast that Lionel's internal sight almost failed to lock onto them, causing his pupils to constrict. Their coordinating, Lionel's blackwood spear immediately shifted, his feet sweeping through the air as he changed his stance. He took a heavy step backward, causing a boom across the air and instantly sent over 10 piercing strikes forward. Dang, 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 dang. The odd sound of a cross between his flesh and blade resounded. Lionel quickly deflected many of these swordfish, sending them flying past his shoulder. However, these well-coordinated attacks didn't seem to have any intention on stopping anytime soon. The latest _IP_SODIES are on the website. Lionel had hardly finished his last pierce when a flutter of black appeared before him. He caught a fluttering black feather out of the corner of his eye. In most circumstances, it would seem like an ominous sign, and that it was. The black swan seemed to have only needed a single flap of its wings to appear before Lionel. Its wings were coated in a dark, scythe-like energy that split the air in its path. Lionel almost didn't notice its presence, and when he finally did, its wing was already before his throat. It was right at that moment that Lionel's demeanor changed. It only took him a few exchanges to understand that these weren't simple opponents. Not only did they seem to have intelligence matching that of humans, but they also had individual power that made him feel somewhat numb. Any singular mistake might truly cost him his life. In that case, it was time to be serious. Beneath his visor, his expression suddenly became a deathly cold. Seemingly sensing something, the black swan suddenly rolled itself into a ball, vanishing into the shadows and teleporting dozens of meters away. That's Little Black Star's ability. Does it also have a shadow world? Lionel made a mental note, but he had already stepped across the skies. A next volley of swordfish had already appeared before him. They tore through the skies even more menacingly than they had in the past, seemingly having used the beaver's tail as a springboard this time. Visit. For the best no understanding, he experienced another wall of wind threatened to send Lionel flying into the distance, but he held his ground, the tip of his spear vibrating for just a moment. Meteoric impact. Every time Lionel's spear swept forward, another swordfish would be blasted into minced meat. The penetrating power of his spear force seemed to have increased to another level, almost making it seem as though they were being destroyed from the inside out. It was then that the enormous blue whale dwarfing crocodile seemed to have finished preparing something, its gaze seething as it locked onto Lionel. It was clear that the sudden murder of so many of its comrades had infuriated it. It opened its large mouth, revealing a row of shimmering jagged teeth. Unlike what one might expect from a crocodile's mouth, it was eerily clean, almost as though it hadn't had a drop of meat in its lifetime, something Lionel felt should have been impossible. However, what happened next gave Lionel all the explanation he needed. Beneath the ocean's surface, the crocodile's stomach had bulged to 3 times its original size. The instant it opened its mouth, its neck followed the same pattern. Its scales stretched so thin that the translucent skin between them became obvious, reddening beneath the strain. And then, it roared. Visit. For the best no understanding, he experienced a jet of a water the likes of which put the previous wave to shame suddenly erupted. It was so violent that the sound barrier shattered instantly, concentric circles of air being torn and blasted apart as it ripped a path toward Lionel. In one blink, it had exited the crocodile's mouth, but in the next, it had already swallowed Lionel whole, far too quick for him to react. Chapter 989. Chapter 989. No way. Lionel felt as though all the bones in his body were being shattered. Even his divine armor cracked in several places, finding it difficult to hold up. It was though he was being crushed by a continuous wall that only seemed to grow more powerful as he was shot into the air. Blood flew from Lionel's mouth, marring the inside of his silver helmet. He knew well that if it wasn't for his divine armor space domain being activated by him in the last moment, he would have already been crushed into minced meat. By the time the last of the water vanished, Lionel had been blown so high into the atmosphere that he could see the light of day again. His armor was filled with cracks from head to toe and his body felt like it was on the verge of collapsing. It was only thanks to a combination of his spatial domain and his metal body that he was still able to hold on to his consciousness. Damn, Lionel coughed. If only he had the luxury of taking a breathing. Unfortunately, that was exactly what he didn't have. Seemingly sensing that Lionel was somehow still alive, the black swan appeared from thin air, delicate black feathers once again signaling its appearance. Its wings pierced toward Lionel's neck once again. Somehow, its feathers felt like an abyssal black hole. They had no weight or depth to them and seemed endless. A single touch from them could result in someone becoming just as empty. Visit. For the best no understanding experience before it could slice through Lionel, he vanished once again. His body might have been collapsing, but his dream force was just fine. There was nothing in this world stopping him from casting spells, nor did he have any intention of dying in this place. The black swan seemed to realize that something was wrong, but it was already too late. Valiant seal. To form 4 pillars took more than half of Lionel's stamina, but that was if he was on the ground. Because he had to accumulate his own earth force without relying on the earth, the difficulty suddenly skyrocketed, taking with it at least 70% of his stamina. However, this time, Lionel felt he only needed 3, so it took up just over 50%. At that moment, the skies trembled. 3 pillars etched with ancient carvings appeared around the black swan in an instant. It immediately tried to blink away as it had done before, but just when it rolled onto itself, vanishing into the shadows to blink away, there was a sudden spine-tingling sound of bones snapping and breaking. Bang! The neck of the black swan was twisted into an odd angle. Lionel hadn't even needed to do anything before its vitality began to fade away. Visit. For a better user experience as expected, the Black Swan wasn't teleporting, it was rather moving through space at an alarming speed. When it entered its shadow world, its speed had almost no limits on it as it was no longer corporeal, so it would feel as though it was teleporting. However, the barriers of Lionel's valiant seal were almost like the barriers to a world. Trying to charge through that even with a shadow world would be impossible. In fact, even if the Black Swan was truly teleporting, it would have been in for the same rude awakening. The Black Swan just so happened to lead with its neck, the most fragile part of its body, so it was unlucky in seeking its own death without understanding the situation it was in. But this saved Lionel the stamina he would need to use to truly finish this battle. He took deep breaths, stepping into the triangle of pillars and stretching out a palm. Twinkling lily, carnivorous stem. At that moment, delicate flower petals formed of light elemental force began to form around Lionel. However, their beauty only lasted for a moment before they suddenly whipped out with vines. The vines themselves were quite beautiful, being coated with delicate white cotton filaments. But their actions were horrifying. They latched onto the body of the dying Black Swan, tearing into its flesh and pumping out its vitality. Lionel could feel his body quickly healing. In just a few breaths, not only was he back in top condition, but even his divine armor had been healed of all its cracks. The body of the Black Swan turned to ash, leaving behind a beast crystal swirling with black fog. Lionel could tell that it was of exceptional quality. It would most definitely sell for quite a number. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_g experience, Lionel took a deep breath. The dimensional verse was really too unpredictable. He knew that it was a bit reckless to rush out into the ocean all alone like this. However, if that creature wasn't handled, it would only cause more problems in the future. Lionel felt like he was the only one who could do it. Of course, a part of him also understood that his grandfather had such great control over Earth that he could have likely stopped this already if he wanted to. It was once again a case of Lionel and his grandfather's ideologies clashing. Emperor Fox likely believed that this was a good method of tempering his people, while Lionel didn't feel like lives needed to be risked needlessly. And yet here he was risking his life. Lionel shook his head. Putting his blackwood spear away, he flipped his palm to reveal another. It radiated the aura of a quasi-silver spear, but it was very much different from the silver spear he usually used. It had a blade on just one end and it almost looked like a trident. However, its second and third blade were so small in comparison to the middle blade that they almost looked like accessories. The body of the spear was coated in beautiful sapphire scales and its blade was a translucent blue crystal that the waters below seemed to have already reacted to. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_g experience, let's end this quickly. Lionel thought, shooting forward. Lionel had no way of knowing that he wasn't the only one gunning for this mysterious storm-controlling creature. Chapter 990. Chapter 990. Logic across the dimensional verse. In a familiar villa, just days after undergoing what could be considered to be a life-altering change, Aina's eyelashes finally fluttered open. The first thing she felt was herself being hit by a wave of memories. As though she was reliving her own life piece by piece, she recalled everything with striking clarity. If it had to be described, it felt like she was a computer downloading files one by one. She stared blankly at the ceiling, all sort of weird emotions coming one after another, but she didn't quite know or understand how to process them. It was similar to how a child might not understand the complex inner workings of relationship dynamics. A child might comprehend surface emotions, but complex, multi-layered ones would be beyond their comprehension. At the same time, empathy would also be something difficult for them to grasp, at least not when it came to placing another above themselves. These matters became very complicated very quickly. A toddler might be able to understand emotions by reading someone's facial expressions, but they wouldn't necessarily understand that someone's outward showing of emotion might be different from what they felt on the inside. And even if an older child might understand this, they wouldn't understand more complex emotions like bittersweetness, nor would they grasp morality and beliefs and how it might connect to what a person was feeling. Aina didn't lose her memories, nor did she lose her ability to feel emotion, but what she had lost was the ability she had built over her more than 2 decades of life, how to interpret and maneuver around her own feelings and that of others. And, when it was all boiled down, wasn't this the core of what a person would call personality? Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_g experience, things like holding on to 2 frames of mind at the same time, how to control impulses and the emotions that came with them, or what sort of morality should govern her emotions had all been lost on Aina. The result of this was Aina becoming somewhat detached from her emotions, not because she didn't have them, but because she didn't quite understand what they meant. Even her sense of self hadn't quite redeveloped, so while logic told her that the person in her memories was indeed herself, she still couldn't quite connect to this version of Aina. It was like she was trying to fit together two puzzle pieces that were misaligned. No matter how hard she pushed, she couldn't quite fit them together. Aina. Aina blinked. She turned her head toward the voice, but there was a lack of recognition in her eyes. It was clear that she had turned not because she heard her name, but rather because someone had spoken when she had thought the world was filled with silence. It was quite a unique feeling. It was almost like she was a baby hearing sound for the first time. While she had been going through her memories, she hadn't quite grasped that everything she remembered had sound attached to it. So, for those brief moments, she thought that the world was soundless and she was okay with that. Only to come to find out that she was wrong about this. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Yuri stood over Aina's bed with Savon by her side. By now, Savon had already been briefed on what was going on with Aina, so she had agreed to stay by Aina's side until she could finally manage to fit those two pieces together again. Seeing the somewhat blank look Aina was giving them, Savon was shaken. There was a hint of recognition in Aina's eyes, but it didn't come with the same emotion it should have usually come with. It was almost like the two of them had been estranged. It was a truly odd feeling. Aina clearly remembered them, but it was like she might as well not have. Oh, Aina tried to speak, but it felt somewhat foreign. She paused and adjusted her voice to speak again. But it came with a sudden blast of mental coercion that made Yuri and Savon shiver. The wave of soul force whipped about the estate, causing many to freeze in their tracks. And yet, Aina had only spoken a single syllable. Yuri's pupils constricted. Adoptive father was correct. With her mental blocks gone, her talent has been fully unleashed. I never thought that the difference would be so exaggerated. Visit. For the best no understanding experience, seemingly realizing that something was wrong, Aina closed her mouth again. She felt like a piece of her was going away whenever she spoke, and it made her feel weird, almost like she could project herself onto the outside world. An added layer of complexity that was difficult to manage suddenly manifested itself. Yuri had no idea how Aina's ability to project her will onto the world would affect the rebirth of her personality. At first, Aina was a bit cautious with speaking, finding the novel feeling somewhat odd. In her memories, she could tell that she always had this ability, but she consciously reined it in after she awakened it. However, she couldn't quite understand why. From what she could tell, there were two reasons. First was that it was wrong to coerce people, and the second was that it saved stamina for battle. No matter how hard Aina tried, she couldn't quite come up with a reason that justified the first. Why was it wrong to coerce people? However, when she traveled down the rabbit hole of the second reason, she found it made more and more sense. Battle was about survival, and every human wanted to survive. Apparently, she really liked to battle. It was exciting. She also liked to win. Winning was fun. In that case, it made sense to save power for those moments. They call it logic? Visit. For the best no understanding experience, Aina thought aloud, not quite realizing that she should be thinking in her head. After Yuri spoke, she thought that all her memories had sound to them, including her personal thoughts. So she spoke them out loud, not quite knowing better. Logic. He likes logic, right? Yuri blinked. She could tell who he was immediately. Chapter 991. Chapter 991. Water Domain Spear. Aina didn't seem to need much convincing that survival and battle were important. Maybe she felt that these things were extremely fundamental and didn't need to be explained further, or maybe she was just not aware of the hypocrisy of her own thoughts. She easily accepted one thing she liked, but couldn't easily accept something that could be deemed as her sacrificing for the sake of someone else. At the same time, she also found that she very much liked the concept of this logic. She sat up from her bed a bit too easily. Luckily, she didn't use excessive strength, as she may very well have hit the ceiling already. She blinked and looked around. If you use logic for everything, things become very easy, right? Aina didn't seem to be speaking to anyone in particular. It was only then that Yuri and Savon realized that she was thinking out loud, leaving them somewhat speechless. They looked toward one another but didn't say much. Just talking aloud had already shifted Aina's mentality so much, they were almost scared to say anything more. At the same time, though, wouldn't everyone be speaking around her? It wasn't exactly like they could just shelter her from everything or else that would defeat the entire purpose. So rather than staying silent, Yuri tried to start a conversation. Logic? Why do you say that? Because my memories say that I love him, but I don't understand why. I thought that if maybe I thought like him, then I could understand. I also like the way he thinks, it seems to make sense. Visit. For the best no underscore v underscore it understand G experience. Aina blinked. Yuri didn't know if it was an illusion or not, but Aina's golden eyes seemed to grow brighter whenever she said him. They practically radiated air own light at this point, making it difficult for Yuri to look at her directly. I see. Yuri nodded. So what do you want to do? Right. Train. Aina's eyes lit up. She found in her memories that she really liked to do that. And she felt it was logical too. The more training she did, the more powerful she would become, and the more battles she would win. Also, the more fit that she was, and the stronger she became, the longer she would live and the higher her chance at survival would be. These things all made logical sense to her. Plus, she felt something in her blood calling out to her. She really wanted to swing a blade. The bigger, the better. Before Yuri and Savon could react, Aina had already dashed by them, her speed seemingly having increased by several levels. If it wasn't for Yuri's powerful mind, Aina would look no different from a blur to her. Yuri could sense that Aina's blood was flowing far more smoothly. If in the past it had been working against her, it was now working with her side by side to the point their sum was exponential of what it had been before. When Yuri and Savon finally caught up, they found Aina standing in the courtyard, but there was a slight panic on their faces. The current Aina truly looked like an untouchable fairy. She had a bright, childish smile on her face as she swung her axe. But this wasn't the main problem. Visit. For a better underscore user experience, the issue was that she was wearing a silk nightgown that Yuri had put on her after helping her clean herself thoroughly during the last few days. It came to her knees, but the string straps that hung from her shoulders revealed much of her alluring collarbone and graceful arms. Though she hadn't exposed anything too unseemly just yet, with every flutter of the wind the gown came closer and closer to doing so, riding up the elegant curve of her thighs and hips. Luckily, Aina was wearing proper undergarments, or the sight might have been even more scandalous than it was now. But everything from her long, fluttering hair to the delicate structure of her face made it feel as though the world was revolving around her. The servants of the estate all had come to a grinding halt. Most of them were women, but there were most definitely some men around. This was the very first time they had seen Aina without her mask on, and they felt shaken to their cores. The way the silk wrapped around her toned belly and nearly split down her two round, bouncing cheeks was enough to make almost anyone faint from desire. Aina. Yuri rushed forward with a blanket, covering Aina completely and almost getting her head cut off in the process. Aina blinked in confusion, not sure why Yuri was stopping her. Her first instinct was to fling Yuri away from her, but her memories told her that this was a bad thing to do, even though she didn't quite understand why. However, what was obvious was that she was visibly annoyed. She glared at Yuri, causing the latter to shiver uncontrollably. She could sense a killing intent pervading Aina's gaze that made her blood run cold. Visit. For a better underscore user experience, just when Yuri was at a loss for what to do, a figure entered the courtyard under the escort of a maid and Aina's father. This figure had a servant of his own by his side, carrying a box that held several precious ingredients to wish Aina a speedy recovery. However, when he laid eyes on Aina, he stood frozen. Even though she stood in such an odd position, holding a massive axe in one hand and with Yuri draping a large curtain over her body, he still felt as though all things had stopped. Richard had never seen such a beautiful woman in his life. Across the dimensional verse, deep within a storm, a young man swung a trident-like spear, violent whirlpools of volatile water surging around him. 3 pillars carved with ancient patterns swirled about him like an ultimate defense. He weaved in and out of large swaths of oceanic beasts like he too was a fish in water, his momentum only climbing and growing. Raising up his water domain spear, its dragon-like sapphire spear heeded his call. The roar of a flood dragon shook the skies as several water serpents surged out from the blackened ocean. Lionel stood amidst them all, several carcasses of colossal beasts floating about the surface around him. Get out of my way. His voice reverberated like a low, rumbling growl. For reasons he wasn't quite certain of, he suddenly felt enraged. The latest underscore AP underscore SOTIs are on underscore the website. Chapter 992. Chapter 992 Flexibility Horned water serpents wrapped around Lionel as though they were flood dragons. Every time he swept his spear forward, one would blast through the air with no less strength than the water beam of the crocodile. Carnivorous fish and swaths of swordfish were shattered on impact, erupting into blood mist that was instantly swallowed up by the dark waters. Lionel stepped onto the surface of the ocean, whirlpools surrounding his feet and making it almost impossible for anything to attack him from below. His spear spun in his hands, the roar of the flood dragons fusing the booming thunder above. Beneath the surface of the water, schools of carnivorous fish tore a path toward Lionel's feet. However, they were shredded to pieces the instant they entered the range of the whirlpools. Even in the darkness, the blood around where Lionel stood grew so concentrated that the blackness of the sea became a deep magenta. A violet fog hung around Lionel, fusing into his domain and making its strength and range increase by several fold. At that moment, the blue whale dwarfing crocodile had prepared another projectile, sending it beaming across the ocean's surface and toward Lionel. Right then it was like the waters had been split in two. The surface curved and bent away from the thick pillar of sonic booming water. Just the trench alone was as much as 100 meters deep, making one feel especially small beneath the vastness of the ocean. Visit. For a better user experience, however, Lionel didn't even look in that direction. 3 ancient pillars that had been revolving around him suddenly sprung into action on their own, splitting 2 away from the group. Bang, bang, bang. A sheet of spatial force seemed to separate Lionel from the world of the crocodile. No matter how the beam bashed and banged against the 2 connected pillars, they did nothing more than tremble slightly. Just when it seemed that things were finished, the 3rd pillar suddenly acted, forming the triangular formation once again. But this time the beam suddenly found itself passing through the initial barrier and becoming trapped. Under the shocked horror of the crocodile, the pillars rotated and space distorted. At that instant, the beam of water that had been as straight as an arrow warped, curving back toward the mountainous crocodile. A roar pierced the skies, but the crocodile couldn't react in time. It was pierced right through the eye, its scale erupting into a rain of hard carapace, flesh and blood. The crocodile was rocked out of the ocean and sent shooting backward, even crashing into the beaver. Lionel vanished, appearing above the 2 rolling beasts. His silver armor shimmered beneath the dark hues, the frequent streaks of lightning that rumbled the skies above causing the lighting and shadows to dance across its peaks and crevices, making Lionel look quite menacing despite the fact his face was hidden from view. Visit. For the best no_understreet experience, seemingly sensing that something bad was about to happen, the island-sized piranha stopped commanding its carnivorous fish after Lionel and took action itself, quickly trying to close the distance. But by then, Lionel had already raised his spear high into the skies. The countless flood dragons surrounding him began to revolve, quickly fusing into a singular snaking dragon whose roar tore a hole in the dense black clouds above, revealing a singular ray of sunlight that shone down upon Lionel. Lionel's blade descended, the water dragon fusing into one with his downward momentum. Zajir. Bang, bang, bang. Lionel ripped a gaping wound right through the crocodile's injured eye, turning its brain into minced meat. But as though that wasn't enough, the water dragon didn't pause for even a moment, shooting out of the crocodile's body and ripping right through the mountain-sized beaver it had collided with. Lionel shot back into the skies, a tornado of crimson blood following his wake. He roared beside himself, shaking the rainbow piranha to its core. However, it was already too late by the time the piranha realized it had fallen into a trap. Its head separated from its body, leaving a trail of fishy organs as it continued to swim forward several dozen meters before it realized what had happened. Only the moment before its gaze dimmed did it realize that it had swam between 2 of Lionel's pillars. Visit. For the best no_understreet experience, Lionel took a deep breath, his heart still simmering. The power and flexibility of his valiant seal technique couldn't be underestimated. It was most definitely the core reason he won this battle, even beyond his quasi-silver water domain spear. And the best part was that after they had been summoned, the stamina it took to sustain them was far less. However, Lionel didn't have the mind to care right now. He shook his head, not quite understanding why his emotions were so agitated. He had been in quite good control of his own mind recently. This was definitely odd. Shaking his head again and forcing the crimson from his eyes to recede, Lionel didn't bother to unsummon his divine armor. He had a feeling that he would be needing it again quite soon. Instead, he began to allow the massive corpses littered around him into the segmented cube. Quite soon he had 3 enormous beast crystals before him, one from the beaver, another from the crocodile and the last from the rainbow piranha. This beaver has very powerful physical abilities. It'll be good for Franco to absorb this. I had thought that this crocodile had a water-based ability, but it seems that it's actually a swallow ability, it just has a clever way of using it. The piranha has a beast control ability. I guess these last two can be sold then. Lionel distracted himself with these thoughts. But he was very soon distracted once again by something less superficial. These swordfish. Lionel had long since realized that these swordfish all seemed to have the same blade-like ability. He had planned to see if there were any powerful ones among them that could help Joel strengthen his own, but what he actually found left him surprised. Visit. For the best no_vel_8_G experience. Chapter 993. Chapter 993 Ranged. The swordfish all seemed to be identical. Even their beast crystals were all the same. It made Lionel feel somewhat speechless. How was this possible? Logically, abilities should be random. He had already found it weird that all the swordfish seemed to be using the same ability, but he had accepted it in the midst of battle for two reasons. The first was obvious, he simply didn't have the heart to mind such things while his life was on the line. But the second reason was more satisfying, or at least he thought so. Since humans could have lineage factors, why couldn't beasts? Lionel wasn't certain of this before, but he thought that the appearance of these swordfish proved that this was possible. After all, he couldn't think of any other reason why all of these creatures would have the same ability if not for this. The truth of the matter was that being born on or near the water had no bearing on what kind of ability an ocean beast was born with, just the same way being born near the coast had nothing to do with what Lionel's ability became. Even the crocodile who Lionel thought had a water ability turned out to have something completely different. The black swan had a darkness-related ability. The beaver had a physical boost ability. So on and so forth. None of it was related to water, despite the fact many of them were fresh or saltwater beasts. The same should be true of the swordfish, and yet all their beast crystals were identical. Not only were they identical, but they had the same size, same roundness, and were even located in the same part of their body. With what Lionel knew about the dimensional verse, this was ridiculous. There was a reason his feat of killing those colossal squids was so impressive. The location of a beast's crystal varied, and this variation only grew as these beasts grew in size. Though their beast crystals did often grow in size along with them, it wasn't to scale, often resulting in one having to find a needle in a haystack. Visit. For a better user experience, these fish were quite small compared to their counterparts, but each swordfish was still between 1 and 2 meters long. After Lionel realized the oddity, he paid closer attention only to find that the eerie similarities only seemed to continue. All of the swordfish were exactly 1.75 meters long. All of them had beast crystals that deviated 0.23 centimeters to the left of their skulls. They all had the same number of scales, the same length of sword blade, the same exact shade of color. Were they cloned? What the hell? Lionel found it all to be incredulous, and for good reason. If someone had the ability to clone this many fifth-dimensional beasts, just what kind of power could they wield? It might have looked easy for Lionel to deal with the swordfish he had, but it had to be remembered that he was Lionel. Not just anyone could do what he had done. Quite frankly, Lionel had gotten lucky. The larger the beast, the more powerful they seemed to be. Though Lionel didn't know what this meant for Little Black Star, this was what he had experienced, at least on this battlefield. If instead of cloning these small swordfish it was instead something far more dangerous than this. No, this wasn't even necessary, just these school of swordfish could probably blast a path through the coast. Lionel realized then that this creature had more power in its hands than it seemed, it just couldn't be bothered to use it against the invalids and preferred to force the humans to deal with it. Lionel was truly at a loss for how he should be reacting to this. Visit. For a better user experience, these beast crystals. In the end, Lionel had collected as many as 238 of them. All of them still identical. However, he had already accepted this. What he was more intrigued by was the force swirling about them. This blade force. It's so pure, so controlled, but it still feels fundamentally different from spear force, and it also feels fundamentally different from sword force as well. Lionel's heart shuddered and he felt like he had suddenly been enlightened by something. He stared at the beast crystals so intently it felt like he might bore a hole into them, the golden spear on his forehead becoming brighter and brighter. Lionel had always been wondering what was so special about spear force. As far as he was aware, it just sharpened his blade. But why was there a distinction between it and other blade weapon forces then? Why not just call them all blade force? Lionel stretched out 2 fingers and pierced at empty air, causing a dull shing sound to resound. He did it again. This time the sound was even sharper. It was as though the blades were running across each other. He repeated the action for a 3rd time. This time the force seemed to vanish into the void. But, in the next moment, the ocean was split into 2, forming a trench even deeper than the one caused by the crocodile's breath. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_ng experience, when Lionel was observing the swordfish's beast crystal, he realized that they all seemed to act in a similar and predictable pattern. Blade force wanted to hack at and sever everything. It was quite violent. And yet, within the beast crystal, it actually became something that Lionel could see a pattern in. The moment Lionel saw this, he reframed the way he viewed his spear force. Rather than focusing on what confused him about it, he focused on what he could put into a designated pattern. What was predictable about spear force? Lionel thought the answer was quite simple. Range? If there was one defining characteristic that separated spear force from blade and sword force, it was that singular word. Lionel had only barely latched onto the idea when he suddenly felt that there was nowhere his spear force couldn't reach so long as he willed it. And yet, he wouldn't need to rely on spatial force. Lionel pierced his fingers out again. Over half a kilometer away, the head of an approaching colossal squid imploded from the inside out. Lionel had no idea just the realm he had stepped into. He almost forgot about the danger looming overhead as the quasi-silver spear in his hands began to tremble madly as though to roar out its happiness. The latest _AP_SODIes are on _the website. Chapter 994. Chapter 994 Resources. Lionel felt like he was in a daze, his spear force undergoing a qualitative change that even made his spear embryo evolve. The spear mark on his forehead became more prominent and the spear domain around him seemed to increase in power by a measure. Lionel looked down at the spear in his hand. It vibrated wildly, dancing about in his hands as though praising something. Lionel continued to look down at it for a long while, consolidating something within his heart. He knew that this excitement wasn't from the spear but rather from the consciousness that was buried within it. This consciousness didn't come from the spear itself, but rather its previous owner whose will had been imposed upon it. Why was it that Lionel found listening to your weapon to be so ridiculous? It was exactly because of this. To begin with, it wasn't a weapon that was speaking. If he picked up a normal spear, no matter how much he improved his spear force, it wouldn't react in the slightest. This was why, despite having felt the sentience of his spears before, Lionel was completely unmoved by it all. Lionel was in a position where he was lucky enough to learn from his predecessors, but he also didn't want to be controlled by their thoughts. His current spear force had suddenly increased in power by more than 10-fold, but if it had been explained to him by someone else, the leap wouldn't be nearly as exaggerated. Visit. For a better user experience as far as Lionel was concerned, if there was a planned path for how a spear should progress and increase in strength, there had to be someone who had done it first. Then, that person had to have had the ability to explain and describe just what evolution they had undergone to reach that stage so that their knowledge could be passed down to others. By this point, Lionel's feelings on the matter should be clear. Someone else could do it, why couldn't he? Listening to a spear? What kind of ridiculous nonsense was that? He only needed his own self. In fact, if not for the thoughts of these spears distracting him, he felt like he could have figured this out long ago. If not for him having set aside these powerful spears to use his blackwood spear for a while, his mind wouldn't have been so clear on what the next step would be. Even if he managed to see the oddity of the swordfish beast crystals, his mind would have been too fogged to take the next step so confidently. Why was it that these spears claimed peaks for themselves within the spear domain ring? Why was it that a quasi-bronze and quasi-silver spear could have a spear peak of their own while there was an endless graveyard of spears around them? When you thought about it this way, it was quite odd. If Lionel wanted to, he now had just the right combination of mental strength and spear force mastery to pick up any number of silver-grade spears. However, none of them would have a spear peak to their own. The reason was simple. Quasi-bronze and quasi-silver represented the peak of their levels. They were the kings among experts within their range and they reigned supreme as a result. This was what separated them from the spears that could only loiter around the base of their peaks, and this was why domains represented kingship. Why was it that Lionel's king's might could strengthen his domain so much? Why was it that Lionel's domain led him to kingship over universal force? Why was it that this spear was now trembling in Lionel's hand? Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_ng experience, it all led back to same idea. They were all interlinked and interdependent. Lionel's palm flipped over, causing the water domain spear to vanish in place of his blackwood spear. He swept it out to the side, his spear force splitting the waters and causing waves that stretched out for several kilometers. Lionel shot forward, his 3 valiant seal pillars following closely behind him. He truly wanted to see if there was anything that could get in his way now. As far as he was concerned, wherever he stepped foot was his domain. Yuri was forced to weather the storm of Aina's killing intent. She hoped that it wouldn't cost her life, but now that Richard was here, she definitely couldn't afford to move now. Savon moved forward and happened to block Richard's view of Aina's face. It was only at that point that he finally managed to snap out of his daze and recover, remembering why it was that he was here. The latest _sodies are on the website. The truth was that Richard had never been interested in seeing Aina's face, nor had he ever gone out of his way to get Aina to remove her mask. As far as he was concerned, their relationship was strictly business. Even the thoughts he had of asking Aina to marry him had all been related to how useful she was and little to do with how attracted he was to her. Plus, there were only 2 reasons why a woman would wear a mask. Either she was far too beautiful or she was far too ugly. However, Yuri and Savon wore masks alongside Aina, and Richard had received reports about them being spotted without them before. This made Richard think that Aina was likely the latter of the 2 possibilities and that her friends were just wearing masks along with her as a form of solidarity. He realized now, though, that his conclusion couldn't have been further from the truth. Shaking his head, he gestured to his servant, who cleverly passed on his box to Savon as opposed to Aina. Though Richard was a bit confused about exactly what was going on here, he knew that it was probably best not to ask since Meal had almost not let him in at all. "This is just a token of my appreciation, Miss Brazinger. Much of the resources you asked for can be found within here and much more." Aina blinked. "That's right, resources are important to me too." "Very important?" Richard's brow furrowed slightly. He wasn't quite sure of how to respond to this. The latest _sodies are on the website. Chapter 995. Spader 995 Sniping? Meal frowned. If he had known that Aina was awake now, he would have never allowed Richard to enter. It was only because he thought that his daughter was still in a coma that he had allowed Richard to come under the latter's insistence. After all, as a vassal of the family, there was still a small bit of due respect that he owed to the potential heirs, especially since it seemed that Richard had taken the secure lead in this aspect. It could only be said that this timing was horrible. Meal didn't really care who did and didn't find his daughter attractive. He wasn't one to care about such things. The main issue was that he didn't want any undue influence on Aina's recovery. Richard was a very intelligent young man. He most definitely already realized that there was something off about Aina's current demeanor. Though he likely wouldn't be able to guess exactly what had happened, he didn't need to do that in order to cause problems. Meal took a slight breath and shook his head. For now, pressing forward and rushing Richard out would only make things seem more peculiar than they already were. He could only ride this out and hope that Aina didn't think anything too ridiculous out loud. Though he had a weird expression on for a moment, Richard quickly recovered once again, giving Aina a light smile. "You've done a lot for me, and I can say with great certainty that you are a large part of the reason I've almost secured the official position of heir for myself. Since you've helped me so greatly, how could I not properly reward you? I've made sure to give you more than what you've asked for, and if you need anything in the future, please don't hesitate to reach out." Richard's smile became more natural by the end of his words as he lightly nodded toward Yuri and Savon before turning toward Meal. The latest _sodies are on the website. "I appreciate you allowing me into your home, Sir Brazinger. I won't continue to intrude and will take my leave now. If you need anything, you can feel free to contact me as well." Meal nodded lightly but didn't say much. He knew that the reason Richard insisted on entering his estate today was because he no longer had a reason to hide. Richard had been away from Planet Viola for a long time before returning today. Yet the first thing he had done was come here. He was clearly signaling to everyone that not only was he back, but that he had a powerful vassal under his banner. Since Aina had almost died fulfilling his mission, even if Meal wanted to wash his hand clean of Richard, he couldn't do so. By the time the details of what happened that night became clear, the Brazingers would be irrevocably tied to Richard. "Sorry, adoptive father. Aina just woke up and we couldn't stop her before she came out here." Yuri spoke after Richard and his servant disappeared. Meal shook his head, telling Yuri not to mind. He took a few steps forward and looked into his daughter's eyes, but all he found was a hint of vacancy that made him sigh. Well, it wasn't like he wasn't used to Aina giving him a cold look back, but this was different. There was no frost here, it just bordered on indifference. In a lot of ways, this stung more than the former did, and for good reason at that. Emil wondered if he should take Aina away from planet Viola now, but in the end he decided against it. Though the climate here was volatile, with her being forced to make so many decisions every day, she would quickly come to reform her personality. If things took too long, she might never awaken to her former self ever again. What is most important to you? Emil suddenly spoke, his gruff voice being aimed toward Aina. Visit. For a better user experience, this was the question he planned to ask Aina every day. It was the only push he could give her without influencing her too much. Logic. Battle. Resources. Aina listed out 3 things, her list having increased by 1. Emil nodded and didn't commentate. How this answer evolved would decide if his Aina would ever come back to him or if she was forever lost. Aina didn't seem to understand the complex emotions of her father as she pushed Yuri to the side and let her axe fall to the ground. With a childish excitement and the blanket around her almost falling to the ground, she rushed toward Savon, who was holding up the large spatial box. She was too excited to see what resources she would get. Lionel could feel himself getting closer. There was nothing capable of stopping him. Not only was his speed blinding, but his spear had increased its lethality by several folds. A road of starlight painted Lionel's path forward. His speed branch had long since evolved to this level, and though it was most useful in the vacuum of space, that didn't mean it couldn't be used on land or water as well. Just 20 kilometers away. Lionel thought with narrowed eyes. Then, 5. The latest _SODIs are on the website. This sort of range was ridiculous. To be able to control a storm from so far away. Just what kind of beast was he up against? Of course, Lionel had a feeling that starting and maintaining the storm were 2 vastly different concepts, similar to his Valiant Seal. But Lionel couldn't control his Valiant Seal from more than maybe a kilometer away before things became far too troublesome. And even then he would need to rely on his divine armor to boost his spatial affinity. Suddenly Lionel came to a grinding halt. His stop was so abrupt that an ocean wave shot up several dozen meters. In that moment, a deathly silent arrow pierced through the wave and shot through the water just half a foot before Lionel. Had he still been running at that angle, his forehead would have been pierced through cleanly. Several seconds later, a deep rumbling boom came from within the depths of the ocean, causing the dark waters to surge. Sniping me? Lionel's palm flipped over, his sniper rifle appearing in his hand and whirring to life. Almost 3 kilometers away in the depths of the storm, a bowman with shimmering gold hair and eyes lowered his arms slightly, his expression of confidence being marred by a hint of confusion. Visit. For the best no_SNG experience, is it done? Around the young bowman were several other youths with various colored matching hair and eyes. Together they almost looked like a cosplaying rainbow. However, they didn't get the answer they wanted immediately. The young bowman's pupil constricted before a beam of golden light suddenly appeared right before his brows, causing his heart to freeze over. Chapter 996. Chapter 996. 4 young men. Just when the young golden hair and eyed young man thought that his life was forfeit, a hand with translucent scales suddenly appeared before his face. Bang! The hand was unable to stop the full momentum of the beam of gold, resulting in the golden-haired young man's face being bashed in with the back of it. Blood flew as the golden-haired young man's nose caved in, his body sent reeling backward to the point he nearly fell off of the flying disc the group of them stood upon. He was immediately concussed and felt as though the world was spinning without end all before he fell to his butt, the grip he had on his bow loosening to the point he almost lost hold of it entirely. At that moment, the young man who had saved his life looked down at his palm. He could feel an ache in his wrist that told him that he had nearly broken it. It was clear that he had underestimated this beam of light almost too much. This young man had a head of blue hair and eyes, and judging by his stunned look, he was clearly very much confident in his defensive abilities. Though his translucent scales hadn't been broken, he still felt a hint of pain. Who? Visit. For a better user experience this time, it was a green hair and eyed young man who spoke, being the third of the group of 4. It seemed that his temper was the most fiery of the group, but it somewhat made sense. Being so far away from land made him itchy and trigger happy. It was definitely safe to say that he was the most uncomfortable of the current group. By now, it was very much clear that these young men were members of Earth's hidden families and also that their goal may very well be identical to Lionel's own. The gold hair and eyes of the Lavis family. The green hair and eyes of the Crutus family. The blue hair and eyes of the Aderna. And finally, the fourth and final member of the group was the only one who didn't seem to react with shock or fury. He stood silently, a monocle with numerous floating lenses revolving around his left eye as though the moons to a planet. He was none other than Simeon Brazinger, the first main branch member of the hidden families Lionel had ever met. And even until now he was still the only one. Simeon's gaze narrowed. He still remembered 4 years ago now when he was forced to retreat from the Project Hunt Island. It was a humiliation he still wore on his chest to this very day. He hadn't seen Lionel in a very long time, but the pure dislike he had for him was just as palpable as it had always been. Back then, Simeon had chosen to come out ahead of time to try and lay a foundation and some groundwork for his future plans. However, at every turn, it seemed like Lionel was there to stop him. He had even tried to use the Royal Blue Fort to deal with him, but even that had ended in failure. Visit. For a better user experience, the result was Simeon being forced to return to the family's lands where he hadn't even been allowed to come out for the terrain war. Only after Earth entered the fifth dimension was he finally given some degree of freedom back in return. Yet, in the irony of all ironies, the moment he tried to accomplish something, here was Lionel once again to stand in his way. How could he not want to tear Lionel limb from limb? Simeon? The blue-haired young man called out, seemingly realizing that something was up. Adrin Elilar Xanos. Don't you dare move. He's mine. Simeon's words were baffling. Who was he? And plus, if there was anyone who should get first crack, shouldn't it be Xanos? Just look at him. The blue-haired youth, Adrin, looked toward Xanos to say as much. But when he saw that the latter had grown a mustache of blood from his bleeding nose and how he still seemed to be in a daze, he shook his head. Never mind, Elilar, who had snapped earlier, looked toward Simeon oddly. They all knew Simeon well. He practically never showed any emotion at all. It wasn't coldness, it was just indifference to all things. This had to be the first time they had ever seen him lose his cool. Visit. For a better user experience, Simeon's face was quite expressionless, but a deep red force had begun to pour out from his body. Sometimes I forget that he's a Brazinger. Simeon's palm flipped over to reveal a rattling chain that must have been at least 10 meters long. It had a black body and was coursing with crimson veins and golden barbs. It looked as though there wasn't a single place on its bod that you could touch without ripping your flesh apart, and yet Simeon began to slowly wrap it around his palm, down his wrist and up his arm as though he couldn't feel a thing. At that moment, Lionel, donning his silver divine armor, suddenly appeared in the air no more than 20 meters from them. As for how Simeon had recognized him with his helmet on, maybe only he would be aware of the answer to that. Seeing Lionel, the gazes of Elilar and Adrin narrowed while Xanos was still far too out of it to even register just what was going on. Simeon's red hair waved about gently, the harsh rain in the surroundings not even touching the hem of his clothing beneath the bubble of his flying disc. With a wave of his free hand, 2 balls of light hovered before him before bursting. What was left behind left Lionel's gaze narrowing beneath his visor. 2 enormous metallic birds appeared. Or rather, that was what they looked like on the surface. But their true nature most definitely caught Lionel's attention. Visit. For a better user experience. One more chapter coming today. Chapter 997. Chapter 997. Anytime the 2 metallic birds weren't entirely metallic at all. With a sweep of his internal sight, Lionel could see that they had flesh and blood. The answer then seemed simple. Weren't these 2 birds just wearing armor, then? But this wasn't the reality either. The metal wasn't being worn. It was them. It was as much their skin as flesh could be. In fact, it seemed that there were a few parts of their bodies that could be classified in much the same way. If Lionel didn't have such a dislike of Simeon upon stumbling upon his first cyborg sighting, he probably would have felt that this was very cool too. However, unsurprisingly, Simeon wasn't a person he liked very much at all. Even setting aside what Simeon had tried to do to him, just the fact Simeon treated humans like experimental subjects was enough for Lionel to hate him. Lionel didn't even want to consider what sort of horrid torture these 2 birds had gone through to reach this state either. Lionel's gaze swept by Simeon, landing on Xanos. It didn't take much deduction at all for Lionel to realize that he was likely the one who had shot the arrow. If not for his bloody nose, the bow he was barely holding onto was a dead giveaway. However, after looking around some more, Lionel realized that this storm definitely wasn't being caused by these four. This meant that there was a more than 90% probability that they were looking for the creature at the core of all of this just like he was. There was no coincidence that they were in the exact direction Lionel had been heading in considering the sheer vastness of the ocean. Lionel's eyes narrowed when he remembered what Simeon's ability was. If he was allowed to get his hands on such a creature and he controlled its genes to come under his command, just what kind of devastation would that bring? Remembering back to how Lionel met Little Blackstar, his grip on his spear rotated slightly. Back then, he had almost killed Little Blackstar just to ensure that he never ended in Simeon's hands. Now, it seemed that history was replaying itself. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. The difference here, though, was that while Little Blackstar had only been playful, this beast was costing people their lives. Lionel had no idea what it was that these hidden families wanted, nor did he understand what their purpose on Earth was. But what he did know was that when Earth was pushed into a corner facing the people of Terrain, he hadn't seen a single member of their ilk. All they had done was show up on Avalon and try to poach away King Arthur and his people. After they failed, they vanished and didn't appear again until now when there were once again benefits to be gained while others were falling and dying in the background. These sorts of people. They were the kind Lionel abhorred the most. I'm going to give you two options, Lionel said coldly. Either get the hell out of my sight, or you fall beneath my blade. The fluttering red force around Simeon suddenly surged, his pupils constricting into pinholes. This was most definitely not the Lionel he knew. The Lionel he knew didn't have this edge to him, he didn't have this bloodthirsty air. In fact, he didn't have a willingness to kill at all. That Lionel was like a lion without its claws or a shark without its teeth. But now, Lionel raised his spear, pointing it between Simeon's brows. It was a blatant, undisguised provocation. At that moment, Lionel's aura was palpable. It hung in the air like a violet mist, raising above Simeon's own and suffocating it. Lionel Morales, Simeon said slowly. Visit. For the best no understanding experience, however, what he hadn't expected was for Adrin to suddenly stand out. What did you say, Simeon? Simeon frowned, turning his gaze toward Adrin. The coldness in his eyes made Adrin's own gaze narrow, but the latter didn't back down. All four of these young men were on the same level. On top of that, all of them had entered the fifth dimension. Adrin felt no fear for Simeon, although the latter's power was great. Adrin looked away from Simeon and toward Lionel, suddenly understanding something. I can't let you kill him, Simeon. Adrin finally said. What? Simeon's voice simmered like hot coals, his red eyes flashing with added menace. Lionel Morales is the name of the man who saved my little sister. I owe him a favor. So, I'll only repeat myself once more. I can't let you kill him, Simeon. Adrin's own aura began to leak out, a dense blue force wafting about his body. Though he and Simeon were about the same height, Adrin was far broader, making it seem as though he was towering over Simeon completely. Simeon released a cold laugh. Did you forget why it was that we came here? Visit. For a better user experience, all of that is meaningless in the face of my little sister's life. Adrin replied coldly. So you're going to stand in my way no matter what? Do you really want a war against my Brazinger family? Since when has my Aderna family been afraid of you all? I'm sure you know best that we're the ones who best counter your lineage factor. Do you want to have a try to see how that'll work out for you? I'll give you a sneak peek. Adrin wasn't wrong. If the Brazinger family was the absolute pinnacle of offense, then the Aderna family was the absolute pinnacle of defense. It almost felt like nature knew they were meant to clash, coloring them both blue and red. Adrin turned to Lionel without another glance toward Simeon. Little Nana has told me a lot about you, so consider this my thanks. I won't allow them to interfere and you can take this as repayment. Next time we meet on the battlefield, though, we will most likely be enemies. Adrin was confident in saying this even if Xanos and Elilar chose to side with Simeon in this matter. When it came to stalling and buying time, no one was his better. Lionel gave Adrin a deep look before nodding and shooting off into the distance, his three pillars following closely behind him. They'll make you regret this, Adrin. Visit. For a better user experience, Simeon's voice had once again returned to neutrality, his force vanishing and even his twin pair of metallic birds having disappeared. He regained his composure so quickly that it almost felt too ridiculous. Adrin's eyes narrowed. Anytime. Chapter 998. Chapter 998. Beautiful Simeon soon vanished, teleporting back to what must have been the Brazinger family's estate. This left the three young men behind with Xanos slowly regaining his bearings. When the golden-haired Xanos finally realized just where he was, his head snapped around and he blinked. It was clear that his healing abilities were also far beyond that of a normal individual's. Rather than still being concussed, he seemed to be back to 100% in just a few minutes, just enough to catch a bit of the conversation between Adrin and Elilar. Now he's pissed. You know Simeon is unpredictable, Adrin. I wouldn't want him as an enemy. Adrin shook his head. This has little to do with how uncomfortable it makes me. It's a matter of principle. If not for Lionel, not to mention my little sister, a few of my cousins and other members of the younger ones would have been finished. PFT, Elilar laughed beside himself. Your family went around snatching zones and ended up almost dying, isn't that too funny? Adrin glared at Elilar but let it slide only because no one had truly ended up losing their lives. It was a mythological zone, so the risk was different. If I hadn't already been in the fourth dimension back then, I might have gone as well. It was just unfortunate that it mutated into a unique zone. Visit. For a better user experience, Elilar's pupils constricted. He survived a unique zone? A unique zone was something that Lionel had already come across twice. Well, once that very nearly became twice if he counted the Joan zone. As such, to Lionel it was no big deal and not even as rare as most made it seem to be. But the reality was that to most people, a unique zone was a death sentence. Pure and simple. To put this matter into perspective, one only need to think of the Valiant Pillar heirlooms of the Valiant Heart Mountain organization. That was the level of the technology one needed just to keep reusing an open zone. If one wanted to enter and interfere with a zone, the necessary threshold to meet was even higher. What did that mean? It meant the use of a treasure that was equivalent to the gold-grade Valiant Pillars or even their superior. When things were put into this kind of perspective, just how shocking it was for Lionel to survive was painted out clearly. It also made it more obvious just what kind of enemy he had made by now handing over his findings from the Camelot zone as well. It was no wonder that they were infuriated. If not for the difficulty of traveling to lower dimensions as a higher dimensional existence, maybe they would have already sent someone Lionel couldn't possibly match up against. I see. So it seems that Earth really does have some young heroes of its own. The latest _sodies are on the website. Xanos spoke, wiping the blood from his lips. He didn't seem enraged by what had happened at all. In fact, his eyes had lit up to the point it seemed he might chase after Lionel right this moment. If they didn't know better, they'd think this battle freak was a member of the Brazinger family while it was Simeon who was a member of Xanos Lavis family. They don't just have one of them. Adrin said, looking off into the distance. Well, my fingers are itching. Xanos said with a grin. Elilar rolled his eyes. Can you be a little less shameless? You almost died just now. Lionel very quickly closed in on his destination, the rain above still pelting down and the thick, rumbling black clouds growing as solid as the earth itself. He hadn't hesitated to take Adrin up on his offer. After all, there was no need to fight a battle he didn't have to. Plus, the value of whatever was up ahead was no small matter, this Lionel knew for certain. It was likely that Adrin was also aware, which was why Lionel had birthed a healthy respect for the young man as well. Lionel's forward momentum came to a grinding halt once again. But this time there was no bowman nor was there any arrow. Visit. For the best understanding experience up ahead, as though a halo of heavenly light, there was a small hole in the dense black clouds. Compared to the kilometers of distance these storm clouds covered, this 10-meter wide hole was like a pin drop. A ray of golden light descended from it, gently touching the surface of the water to create a scene that left Lionel completely speechless. All around, the raging tides of black water rose and fell, even crashing about the pillar of slightly slanted light. And yet, the waters that were graced by this light's touch were not only completely and perfectly still, but they had a beautiful sky blue color to them that made one think of clear tropical oceans one could see to the very bottom of. Within this beautiful, still and clear water was a single koi fish with gorgeous golden scales and fins so delicate and flexible that they looked like transparent silk fabrics soaking in the water. The koi fish was just 2 feet in length and was practically an ant in comparison to the colossal creatures Lionel had come across today, and yet it pulled him in while simultaneously giving him a sense of danger he had never experienced before. Beautiful, it was the most gorgeous creature that Lionel had ever seen. Let alone killing it, he couldn't even muster up the fortitude he would need just to harm it. It was like a delicate flower, the absolute last of its kind, radiating the beauty of its ancestors and carrying the weight of an entire species on its shoulders. For a long while, Lionel just stared, his heart gripped by something inexplicable that he couldn't even begin to express in words. Visit. For a better user experience, he was so enraptured that he didn't notice the grotesque, vile and foul-smelling creature that raised its tentacle to his back. Chapter 999. Chapter 999. Risk. Lionel's pupils constricted. He felt his heart pump vigorously and his veins suddenly double in size. Outside his control, his dream counter activated, pumping his body into a state of fight or flight. Without hesitation, Lionel blinked away. Bang! Lionel's eyes widened as he watched one of his valiant seals shatter into pieces beneath the might of a tentacle of blackish purple. Just like that, he was left with only two that he quickly brought to his side. His expression warped as he laid eyes on the monstrosity before him. Had it not been for his dream counter, considering the strength behind that strike, Lionel felt that he would have most definitely died. However, the most shocking thing was that for his dream counter to activate, something must have made his mind go murky. Lionel had many dream counters. One was to activate his instantaneous heal ability when he was on the border of life and death. The second one was the one that had activated just now. It was attached to a strand of internal sight that always monitored his surroundings and was detached from his conscious mind. This strand of internal sight's only job was to calculate the strength of an oncoming blow. If the blow was beyond what Lionel could handle, Dream Counter would activate and drive his body into an optimal state for escape. However, under normal circumstances, Lionel was aware of this process from start to finish. But this time he wasn't woken up until the moment his blood vessel dilated and his heart began to pump wildly. Thanks to this, he was snapped awake. It made him realize that he had entered an odd trance just now, and it was all related to that golden-scaled koi fish. Visit. For a better user experience, that said, Lionel didn't have the time to mind that koi fish now, as this tentacle monstrosity before him was bearing down with a foul smell that he only just now registered. Without hesitation, Lionel used dream sense, splitting his sense of smell to the point it was dulled considerably. Brandishing his spear, he swept it forward, his wrist flicking several times as he retreated. In an instant, dozens of the monster's tentacles were severed, flying about in a rain of purple blood that dripped down the sea below and revealing bowels that left Lionel stunned. Its defenses are terrible. What Lionel didn't realize just yet that it wasn't that the monster's tentacles lacked defense, but rather that his spear force had become too powerful for it to defend against. If it wasn't for Lionel's improvement, it would have taken at least 3 hacks to sever a single tentacle, but now a single sweep took out several. Gem? Lionel's eyes narrowed. After taking out so many tentacles, the monster retreated, but it wasn't before Lionel could catch a glimpse of what was behind the curtain of all those tentacles. Oh? The latest _sodies are on the website. Lionel's conclusion even made his own face go weird. This was because the conclusion wasn't based on his own normal deductions, but rather the result of a spark within his dreamscape. This was to say that what he had just seen ticked off enough boxes under the categorization of what a womb would be to cause a reaction in his dream world. Eggs, warmth, nutrition, placenta. Lionel's eyes widened, his gaze suddenly snapped back toward the gold-scaled koi fish before going back to the monster. He felt like he was on the verge of understanding something when the koi fish suddenly acted. Its mouth opened, causing a small sphere of golden light to form. It looked completely harmless and was just as beautiful as the fish it came from. But, in that instant, Lionel was shaken. That small bead had a concentration of force that dwarfed anything that had come from the storm previously. This little bee, Lionel didn't get a chance to finish his thoughts. The wild churning of the sea suddenly became like a pot of boiling water. The siren call of what sounded like a dying whale sounded from all directions. It was so loud that Lionel was forced to use his dream sense on his ears as well, dulling his senses once again. At that moment, on the coast several kilometers away, the onslaught of invalids suddenly did an about-face and charged toward Lionel's location. The latest _sodies are on the website. Lionel understood immediately that this was the last resort of the koi fish. From what he could see, the koi fish and the tentacle womb were two separate existences. The tentacle womb needed the koi fish for the energy it could provide it, while the koi fish, without combat abilities of its own, needed the tentacle for protection. The earlier onslaught of colossal beasts Lionel had fought were already all the guards the koi fish had outside the tentacle womb. It had sent them all in hopes that Lionel would never get close to it. But that had failed miserably. The tentacle womb could be considered the last line of defense and was indeed far stronger than any of the beasts Lionel had fought on his way here. However, what the two had never expected was for Lionel's breakthrough to make the tentacle womb fare even worse than their vanguard of beasts had. Without a choice, the koi fish could only use its final resort, calling an onslaught of invalids over to deal with Lionel in its stead in hopes that it could find a path to escape. "Can't you just take your loss with grace?" Lionel chided in his mind. "Fuck it. Vice." Lionel's senses reached into the segmented cube and pulled Vice out. The young man blinked in confusion, unsure of what was going on. Vice was none other than one of the two savants that Lionel was raising. Lionel was always hesitant to use them for fear that they'd grow more powerful than he could control, but he had still been slowly releasing their reins. Now it was time to see whether his risk was worth it or not. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1000. Chapter 1000. Vice and Candle. Vice was confused about what was happening, but sensing a threat to his life, he immediately reacted with all the strength he could muster, freezing everything for several kilometers in space as he took a step behind Lionel, fearfully looking around. Lionel's gaze glowed when he felt this. For one, Vice's ability no longer seemed to have any impact on him. This wasn't because Vice wasn't as good a savant as he seemed to be originally, but rather that his ability had barely reached a fifth-dimensional level. Thanks to Lionel's divine armor being constructed with evolution or as its core, what should have been his fourth-dimensional armor actually had the strength and abilities of a fifth-dimensional armor. Thanks to this, he was able to concentrate his spatial domain down to becoming the equivalent of a force skin, thus allowing him strong control over the space force around himself. This was all to say that Lionel was likely the only one not impacted by Vice's ability. However, even this was just the tip of the iceberg. Vice's ability wasn't as simple as a spatial lock. Its boundaries worked similarly to Lionel's Valiant Seal, and were like the borders separating two worlds. This meant that not only were all the invalids surging toward the two of them frozen, but this also meant that the invalids that had been rushing toward them could no longer sense the wild fluctuations force being released by the golden koi fish. Lionel whistled, feeling that savants were really the universal cheat code. If he wasn't restraining Vice's progress, just how powerful would he be by now? Couldn't even wrap his head around it. Visit. For the best no_underscored_understanding experience, how long can you maintain this? Lionel asked Vice. Vice, who had been hiding behind Lionel, looked toward him with a blank expression. Every time Lionel looked into his eyes, all he could see was vacancy. With Candle, she at least had a normal range of human emotion, it was just that she tended to the extreme. However, after a long while of observation, Lionel felt that Candle might have grown up to be a perfectly normal girl had she never been locked away. Now, though, her trauma was a weight on her heart that was difficult for her to release. Vice, however, didn't have these emotions. And any emotion that he did show was just a reflection of what he saw around him, as though he was projecting what he thought others wanted to see rather than being his true self. If someone like Vice had grown up in normal society, he would probably be very charismatic and have a knack for manipulating the people around him. It was just too bad for him that his skill in this facet was stunted by his upbringing, thus allowing Lionel to see through him easily. Even now, while Vice was acting scared and hiding behind Lionel, he was only doing so because this was exactly what Candle would do if she was suddenly brought out like this. The more time those two spent together, the more of her personality that Vice imprinted onto himself. At this moment, though, Vice was looking at Lionel as though he couldn't understand the question. It was then that Lionel chuckled and understood. Stamina? That was something only non-savants had to worry about. Vice's look was as good as telling him that he had no time limit and could hold this indefinitely. He didn't have a concept of how long. Visit. For the best no_underscored_understanding experience, got it. Then keep it up. Lionel brought out the surfboard and allowed Vice to stand on it so he could release his grip on the latter's shoulder. Then he also brought Candle out. As expected, seeing the dark clouds above, the frozen rain in the surroundings, and the giant tentacle monster to the side, Candle immediately shrieked and hid behind Lionel as well. Lionel's approach to dealing with Candle was much different than how he dealt with Vice. He gave her comfort and a few caring words almost immediately. He realized that this was his own bias shining through. After all, he felt that Candle was genuine while Vice was not. But for now he let things play out this way. He wanted to see just how Vice evolved from here. Maybe I shouldn't do this myself. I wonder if the dimensional verse has therapists and psychologists specialized in dealing with savants. But if they do, which of them can I trust? There was a hidden reason why Lionel had chosen to take the risk of raising 2 savants on his own, and that was his grandfather. Lionel simply didn't believe that his grandfather could be so cruel as to kill 99% of Earth's population for the sake of clearing out as many invalids as possible ahead of time, and yet leave such a hidden danger like these savants behind without cause or reason. There was definitely something about this choice that Lionel didn't have enough information to understand just yet. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel patted Candle on the head until her tears were soothed and her breathing became even once more. I just wanted to let you out to experience the world. If you want to go back in, it isn't a problem. Just let me know. Candle sniffled and looked around, her shoulders shuddering when she saw the tentacle womb. She stretched a hand out and caused a massive mirror without borders to appear in the sky, blocking the view of the monster. Only then did she relax. When she swept her gaze around and saw the koi fish, her eyes lit up. So pretty? Lionel smiled. You two stay here, I'll be back. Okay. The two replied at once. The surfboard hovered just a foot over the dark waters, allowing Candle to sit and glide her feet about it. The latest _sodies are on the website. Lionel appeared on the other side of Candle's mirror and observed the tentacle womb. He could tell that it was struggling to move away, but it couldn't no matter how hard it tried. The abilities of savants were truly too sick. Such a powerful creature couldn't even lift a finger to stop it. Can this tentacle womb clone creatures? Chapter 1001. Chapter 1001 Units. Lionel asked the question that had been on the tip of his tongue for the longest time instantly, not holding back at all. Ping, replying to seed, yes. How does it clone creatures? Ping, replying to seed, the creature clones by. Stop. Lionel shook his head. The dictionary had begun going on a long rant about the biological process that the tentacle womb underwent. Clearly, Lionel's question wasn't specific enough. Let's try. What do I need to give this tentacle womb in order to clone? Little Black Star? Lionel didn't really have intentions of cloning Little Black Star because he felt it would be a bit weird. But after hearing the response, he realized that it was naive of him to an extreme to even believe he could. Visit. For a better user experience, ping. 1,283,490,985 units. At first Lionel was confused. But after several probing questions he came to understand the a unit in this context was the equivalent of 1 complete beast crystal. That meant that for this tentacle womb to clone Little Black Star as it was presently constructed, it would need over 1 billion units of Little Black Star. Lionel soon came to understand that this was because of the void beast blood that Little Black Star had ingested. But even if this blood was ignored, according to the dictionary, it would still take 1,983 units to clone Little Black Star. Lionel could only be left speechless by this. For one, the value of void beast blood had suddenly become very obvious to him. There was actually such a large gap between the value of Little Black Star alone, even as a shadow sovereign, and just a vial of its blood. Not even its beast crystal. And secondly, he realized that just a beast as talented as Little Black Star required almost 2,000 units alone. Hold on. Lionel suddenly realized that he had forgot something important. What's the amount of energy the tentacle womb would need to produce 1 Little Black Star? Lionel almost didn't want to hear the answer, but when he did, he felt his body go numb. He had thought that the needs of the silver tablet were already ridiculous, but this tentacle womb made it look like child's play. Even if Lionel killed all the oceanic creatures Earth had to offer, the amount wouldn't be enough. Lionel shook his head. He hadn't considered one other thing as well. The latest _sodies are on the website. This was all theoretical. Just because the dictionary calculated that the tentacle womb would need this amount, that didn't mean that the tentacle womb would survive swallowing such an amount. In fact, Lionel's next question confirmed this perfectly. So that's how it is. As of right now, the womb's limit is producing 5th-dimensional creatures. It needs to consume 13 units to reproduce. If I tried to make it clone a creature worth 14 units, it wouldn't be able to ingest it properly and would even end up hurting itself. It's no wonder the creatures it cloned were so small and weak comparatively speaking. That's its limit. The swordfish was worth about 3 or 4 units at most. The question becomes, Then, how do you find creatures close enough in identity to count as units of one another? This was the next problem Lionel ran into. These so-called units implied that you needed to swallow creatures that were nearly identical in species and ability. But how was such a thing possible to find? Even among those sharing the same species, their abilities could vary wildly. Even if this tentacle womb could handle cloning Blackstar and Lionel was willing to do it, the current Lionel only had one unit of little Blackstar and didn't even know where else he would find another Shadow Sovereign mink. How the hell would he even start this journey? It made no sense. But, clearly there was something he was missing, or else how had the tentacle womb created so many swordfish? Was there really a school of identical swordfish out there? What was he missing exactly? At that moment, Lionel's gaze suddenly sharpened as he thought of something. After a series of pointed questions and inquiries, he landed on the response he wanted and his eyes glowed with understanding. The conclusion? Though this tentacle womb had a limit of 13 units, the truth was that it could mostly only produce creatures worth between 3 to 5 units. The reason for this was simple. Rather than absorbing multiple units of the same creature, something that would be impossible, the tentacle womb instead swallowed up powerful creatures and then segmented their abilities into smaller units to create these weaker level creatures. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_ng experience, so, say for example the tentacle womb swallowed up a creature worth 10 units. It was impossible that it would find 9 more exact types of this creature with the same genetic code and ability. So, instead of doing this, it would parse this creature into smaller parts. Because the original creature was innately worth more to begin with, its smaller parts were able to cover all the units these weaker creatures would need to be produced to begin with. To put this in the simplest terms possible, the swordfish that Lionel had fought earlier likely came from a more powerful king swordfish. Unable to reproduce this king swordfish, the tentacle womb instead divided the king swordfish up so that it would be worth multiple units of the weaker creature it eventually came to represent. I understand. So, if this tentacle womb were to, hypothetically, absorb Little Blackstar, the creatures it would produce would be several weaker versions of Little Blackstar instead. Lionel's gaze glowed brighter and brighter as he thought of this, his thoughts spinning as one idea after another popped into his head. He thought of everything from using the blue whale dwarfing crocodile's corpse to create an army of living water guns all the way up to just what kind of monster this tentacle womb would be if he one day strengthened it enough that even giving birth to void beasts was no longer impossible. Lionel understood now just how important this tentacle womb would have been to Simeon. If it was paired with the latter's genetic modification ability, it would be like giving wings to a tiger. I guess that favor can really be considered to be repaid. Lionel took a deep breath and didn't get ahead of himself. Just the birth of a single creature took a ridiculous amount of energy. Why else would the tentacle womb pair up with this golden-scaled koi fish? That said, wasn't that fish still right here? Lionel's gaze shifted toward the frozen koi fish, still looking as beautiful as ever. He even almost fell into another trance. Dictionary, how many units would cloning this guy take? Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel was curious. Was Little Blackstar or this little guy better? You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.